Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku's Heart Beat for a Vampire? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Izuku had never been one to complain. He followed orders, didn't object to his stepfather's rulings and kept mostly to himself. It wasn't that he didn't want company, more often than not he tried to seek it out, but his stepfather Toshinori Yagi was a wealthy military man. They'd traveled all over the world. However, when Izuku's mother, Inko Midoriya, fell ill a couple of years ago, they settled in a large estate in the Austrian Empire, far into the countryside a couple of miles outside the nearest small village. By living so far away, the opportunity for friends was scarce, and those that resided nearby mostly weren't around his age anyway. He lived with his stepfather, though the man might as well have been his biological father since he loved him as such. They had a couple of housekeepers, a tutor by the name Shoto Aizawa and a groundskeeper by the name Hisashi Yamada. Izuku especially enjoyed the company of the last two. Mr. Aizawa could seem cold at first inspection, but he was really caring once you got to know him, and Mr. Yamada was like a beam of sunshine, always singing happy tunes while tending to the gardens. They all knew he lacked company within his own age, so sometimes they overcompensated him with either gifts or affections. Mostly though, despite his loneliness, Izuku was a happy young man, and hadn't endured many hardships throughout his life. He had only once been plagued with an illness that almost took his life when he was but a kid. They lived in England back then. It was the strangest thing. He was young, 6 years old. He had always felt uneasy with the housemaids watching him sleep and had but a couple of months prior to the incident convinced them to let him be alone while falling asleep. He had gone through his nightly routine, and everything seemed normal. He fell asleep quickly, but it didn't take long for him to be disturbed by a violent dream, sending shivers down his spine, causing him to awake suddenly. He looked around his dark room for comfort. The candle had gone out, so there was no source of light but that of the moon. He thought he saw a figure in the room, one too small for it to be a housemaid. He kept quiet and stared, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The figure stepped forth, letting the moonlight illuminate his face. It was a handsome young boy, who looked to be about his age. He smiled mischievously at Izuku, but somehow Izuku felt warm by the sight of this being. He was about to open his mouth and ask the million questions thundering through his mind. Who was this boy? What was his name? How did he get in here? Why was he smiling? However, he didn't have a chance to ask any of them since the boy held a finger to his mouth, signaling for him to be silent. He placed a warm hand on Izuku's shoulder, coaxing him to lie down again. He followed the silent order, and watched the boy's smile widen. The boy crept up beside him, held him close. Izuku had never experienced such comfort and ease before, as he did in the arms of the strange young boy, so he quickly fell asleep again. The minute he drifted off, he was soon startled awake again by a creepy feeling of 2 needles piercing through his chest, and he screamed loudly. The young boy by his side startled back and fell off the bed. Izuku was wailing and screaming from the pain as he saw the strange boy creeping under his bed, hiding. Soon after the door was pushed open and frantic-looking maids scanned the room. He started telling them about the intruder and pointed under his bed. The ruckus had awoken both his parents and tutor, and the house was in a frantic state. They searched high and low for said intruder, but found no one. Everyone was deeply worried about him, and even more so the following days as he caught a wild fever, making his entire body weak and on the brink of giving out. Every physician in town had been called to his aid, but they all came up fruitless. Izuku didn't dare sleep alone for a long time after that and was scared out of his mind. His parents tried to convince him it was but a trick of his mind, and it had been a maid that had comforted him after his nightmare, nothing more. Eventually he gave up on trying to convince them otherwise, but deep down he knew. He knew what he'd seen, and the strange intruder hadn't been a maid. It took a month before the illness wore off. In the meantime they'd moved to Italy in hopes that the change of scenery and weather would soothe his body and mind, and it did. Ever since then, everyone around him had been strangely protective of him. They were all scared he would catch this unknown disease once more, so they never let him out of his sight. It was also why now, at the age of 19, he was still confined to his stepfather's manor. Even despite the fact he hadn't as much as contracted the common cold since then. He knew he wasn't weak or sickly as they all told him, he knew he was healthy, and yet he still complied with their wishes to keep him indoors or to the grounds, most of the time anyways. Sometimes when he got a little too restless, he would sneak off during the night and venture into the dark forest, breathing the fresh air into his lungs. Sometimes he would go to a nearby creek and bathe in the sunlight, other times he would sneak into town. Dazing off again, young master? Mr. Aizawa asked before shutting the book in his hand violently, dragging Izuku away from his thoughts. I wouldn't dare, he said with a twinkle in his eyes that made the teacher pry his thin lips into a smile. What were you thinking of? Mr. Aizawa asked as he sat down beside him. I'm waiting for Shoto's letter, it should have arrived a couple of days ago. Izuku muttered, sighing heavily. Do you think he has gotten tired of me already? He asked nervously, and the teacher smiled warmly at him. I doubt it, young master. Shoto Todoroki was the son of one of Toshinori's friends. Half a year ago, they'd started writing to each other since Toshinori had casually thrown the idea into the air that the two might meet, and that Shoto might come to visit for some weeks. Izuku had eagerly responded to such an idea and had written to introduce himself to his future friend. Slowly but steadily, the two had built a friendship through their exchanged letters. The last thing he'd heard from Shoto was that he had to postpone the visit a little while longer, since they had received a sudden visit from some of his father's old acquaintances. Izuku sighed and leaned back into his seat. I'm just worried, he confessed, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. Why don't we go and pay Hizashi a visit? That always cheers you up. Oh, on first-name basis now? Izuku teased and watched his tutor tense up with a slight blush across his cheeks. On second thought, maybe we should stay here and focus more on the human anatomy. Mr. Aizawa persisted, causing Izuku to chuckle amused. Oh come on, please? I'm always cooped up in here. Aizawa sighed and leaned back. Fine, he said. Izuku smiled brightly. He knew his teacher held a soft spot for him. He shot from his seat and grinned wildly. Go change before we go outside. Heaven knows the young master always manages to fall into a puddle while chasing frogs. Aizawa said with a pointed look. Izuku made a face at him before running away in laughter, heading for his room to change. Despite being from a noble family, Izuku liked the outdoors. He liked getting his fingers dirty by helping Hizashi in the garden. The work had even given him a bit of muscle which he greatly appreciated. At least he didn't look as sickly and scrawny as he used to. Now he had a slightly toned body, a warm tan with freckles sprinkled all over his body. His stepfather didn't like it though, and every time he was caught doing garden work he was called back. However, he was well aware Toshinori cut him some slack since he enjoyed it so much. With a lot less expensive clothes and sturdy boots, Izuku headed to the back door. One of the wonderful things about the estate was its vast grounds. It was huge, with several parts of it engulfed in wild greenery and forest, groves of fruit trees and more flowers than he could count. Young master, Aizawa said in a stern voice as he had been speeding towards Mr. Aizawa and Mr. Yamada. Izuku instantly stopped his sprint and continued in a brisk walking pace instead. He gained on them with flushed cheeks and an innocent smile. Mr. Aizawa glanced at him with a warning. He was well aware that when it came to the outdoors Izuku had a tendency to get overexcited and run into problems. More times than he could count had he been stuck in a tall tree, fallen into a brook, gotten stuck in mud or fallen over his own feet. Izuku loved every second of it though, and he could always get himself out of his mess. Sometimes he lost a boot in his attempts, but he always got back on his feet safely. However, he was also aware that it was in Mr. Aizawa's nature to protect him from such things, trying to prevent them from happening. So, what's on the program today, Mr. Yamada? Izuku asked excitedly, looking through the cart he'd been dragging before stopping to converse with his teacher. Harvesting potatoes, young master, he said and bowed sarcastically. Mr. Yamada was not one to follow the rules when it came to labels and names. He wasn't used to addressing people correctly, and he thought it was funny how Izuku kept on calling him Mr. Yamada despite his attempts to make the boy call him Hizashi. Mr. Aizawa sent Mr. Yamada a warning glare, but there was no bite to his bark. Izuku had noticed how the two of them enjoyed each other's company. Izuku was a bit envious of that. He wished he had that kind of connection with someone. The three of them walked towards the vegetable garden. Izuku quickly got to work, pulling the potatoes up with ease. He had long since learned how to do it properly, so he was quite effective nowadays. "Slow down, kid, or you'll put me out of work," Mr. Yamada yelled after him, making Izuku grin at the compliment. Mr. Aizawa had sought refuge in a nearby shadow, resting against a tree while reading some old book from the library. He looked like he was on the verge of dozing off in the late summer heat. Mr. Yamada was humming a tune as he worked, and Izuku couldn't help but smile at the pleasant melody. However, he stilled once he saw a great big pheasant wandering nearby. Izuku carefully looked over his shoulder, both men busy with their own thing. Izuku turned back to the pheasant with a wicked grin on his lips. He loved hunting. Back when they lived in Scotland for a while, Izuku had a second teacher to Aizawa, who taught him how to hunt. He knew his stepfather wouldn't like it, so he did it mostly in secret. Sometimes he even did it now because he enjoyed the thrill of the hunt. Despite not having his bow and arrow at hand, Izuku was confident he could catch the pheasant without breaking a sweat. He kept low as he crept closer, slowly crossing the grass. When it set off running, he set off with it. His legs were as light as feathers under him, and he continued running with a wild laughter despite his teacher yelling at him to come back. He had already locked his eyes on the prey now. No way was he letting it go. He set off, leaping through the air, and caught it in his hands as he clashed to the ground. The pheasant was struggling wildly in his grip as he locked his hand around its neck, and in one quick movement he snapped its neck. Izuku was grinning wildly as he turned back to the other two men, holding it up like a treasured prize. They both just stared speechlessly at him. "We can have pheasant for dinner," Izuku whined. He ignored their calls once again as he sprinted towards the kitchen to present the cook with his offering. Izuku was met with uncertain eyes as he presented it to the big lady and pleaded with her to use in her cooking at some point. If not that day, soon after at least. She shook her head disapprovingly, but did accept it. Izuku returned to the gardens with a grin. "Just what do you think you're doing?" Mr. Aizawa asked sternly, now standing with crossed arms as he got closer to them. "I caught a pheasant." Izuku smiled proudly. Neither of the two others seemed to share his joy. "Since when have you learned to do that, kid?" Mr. Yamada asked, confused. It was only then Izuku realized his mistake. Firstly, he'd done it in front of others. Secondly, it was so different from the image they saw of him, and he knew the two of them saw him as some innocent kid who was barely an adult despite his age. He mumbled, embarrassed, and rubbed his neck. "Go on, explain yourself," Mr. Aizawa pressed. "It was just a pheasant." Izuku tried to argue. "Pure luck. Pure luck, my butt," Mr. Yamada remarked, earning a disciplining glance from Mr. Aizawa for cursing. "I have never seen you like this, Izuku," Mr. Aizawa said, almost sounding a bit concerned as well as confused. "I like to hunt, so what? Lots of people do." Izuku burst out, wrapping his arms around him while pouting annoyed. "Where on earth did you even learn to do that?" His teacher. "I learned from Mr. Torino a while back. It's not a big deal," Izuku said defensively. "Mr. Torino? But it's been 7 years since we lived in Scotland." Izuku couldn't help but to feel a twinge of anger that the two of them reacted like this, almost like they didn't recognize him. Mr. Aizawa had known him his whole life, moved around with them everywhere, and despite only knowing Mr. Yamada a couple of years, he felt like the two of them were his closest companions. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mr. Aizawa asked. "What's there to tell?" Izuku burst out. "You all treat me like I'm made of glass anyway. No way would any of you have allowed it," he yelled. His sudden outburst seemed to shock the two of them even more. Izuku cursed under his breath as he ran away from there, ignoring their calls. He had never really been an obviously rebellious person. He always bottled up his feelings to please those around him, but somehow, he felt like he was on the verge of exploding. He was an adult now, had been for some time, but he was still cared for as if he was that scared 6-year-old kid who screamed about someone hiding under his bed. And he was tired of it. He was sick of being coddled and stuck at home when there was so much of the world he hadn't seen. He was still receiving schooling every day despite having accomplished a fulfilling education years ago. Sometimes he felt as if he was locked up. He knew that wasn't true and he knew they all cared for him, but at some point, they had to let him out of his cage, let him out into the real world. Izuku had run to the small body of water he sometimes enjoyed during the night. He sat near the edge, soaking his feet to cool him down. Maybe his outburst had been caused by the lack of response from Shoto, or maybe he had just finally snapped. He wasn't sure. He knew he had to apologize sooner or later, but he was so tired of being confined to the grounds. Izuku snapped his head around at the sudden sound of breaking twigs. Mr. Aizawa was closing in on him, but he didn't move. He turned his face back to the water and kicked angrily into the small stream. "Hey kid," he said as he sat down beside him. It wasn't often Mr. Aizawa didn't call him young master, but when he did it was usually because he was either wrapped up in emotions or trying to cheer him up. Izuku guessed this was the latter. They sat in silence for a bit. Izuku wasn't going to speak first since Mr. Aizawa had sought him out, so he just waited silently. "I didn't mean to make you upset," Mr. Aizawa said silently. "We were just surprised." Izuku didn't say anything. "I was surprised, perhaps disappointed you didn't feel like you could tell me something like that, since you obviously enjoyed it so much. I never want you to feel like you have to hide yourself away from me, but I guess I can understand why." He sighed. "Are you going to tell my father?" Izuku asked nervously as he bit into his lip. "I'll have a talk with him, and I'll try to reason with him about keeping you inside the estate. Neither of us want you to feel like you're confined, we are just worried." Izuku huffed annoyed. He probably already knew where this was going. He loved Toshinori, he really did. But the man was beyond stubborn. The few times Izuku had tried bringing up that he would like to explore the world or just go into town, the suggestion had been shut down immediately. "I'm not a kid anymore, and how am I supposed to learn anything about the real world if you won't let me into it?" Izuku said tiredly. "I know. We both know. It's just hard to let you go, I suppose." Mr. Aizawa sighed, sounding deflated. Izuku glanced at him. "I'm sorry about blowing up. I'm not sorry about what I said though, but I could have kept my cool," Izuku admitted, rubbing his eyes. "And I'm not trying to be ungrateful, you all take such good care of me. I can't keep on being locked away like I'm some prized possession. I'm supposed to go into the world, learn how to deal with things myself, succeed and fail on my own." "I'll talk with him," Mr. Aizawa promised. "Good. Thank you," Izuku said, and he meant it. "You're good though, at hunting I mean," Mr. Aizawa remarked, sending me an encouraging smile. "That was nothing, you should see me with a bow and arrow," Izuku stated proudly and puffed out his chest, making the older man chuckle warmly. "Remember that deer we ate last week? That was all me," he said, feeling emboldened. Mr. Aizawa sent him a look before rolling his eyes. "And the cook has been accepting these animals?" "Oh yeah, she pretends like it's a nuisance, but I've seen her smile when she thinks I don't notice." Izuku grinned. "So what, you've been hunting in secret?" Mr. Aizawa teased, making Izuku blush. "Yeah well, mostly at night if I've got the time I skin or pluck the animal so it's all ready for her when she wakes up," Izuku stated proudly. It felt freeing to be able to boast about his skills like this, instead of keeping everything a secret. "Troublemaker," Mr. Aizawa huffed as he got back onto his feet, offering his hand to Izuku, which he took. Mr. Aizawa asked him questions about his hunting as they walked back to the estate, and Izuku was over the moon, talking about the activity which he had enjoyed so much in secret. Mr. Aizawa was not blind to the sparkle Izuku's eyes got when talking about something he was passionate about. Despite being weary when he first saw how easily and precisely Izuku had taken away the pheasant's last breath, without a single shed of remorse, he realized he might have overreacted. He was aware that over the years Izuku had built an image of discipline and innocence since it was expected of him, so to see how opposite he could be had rightfully shocked him. However, once he saw how excited the younger green-haired man had been, once he started talking about it, he could not help but to feel Izuku was as he'd always been. Toshinori had been livid once Mr. Aizawa spoke with him about the extracurricular activities going on earlier this afternoon. However, the earnest plea in Mr. Aizawa's eyes as he requested more leniency towards Izuku's expectations, he softened slightly. He had promised to think the matter over thoroughly before he decided what he would do. So, dinner that night was wrapped in silence. Izuku felt his stepfather's blazing gaze, so he kept his head down and focused on picking at his food. The cook had managed to prepare said pheasant for dinner, and it was delicious. Izuku tried not to look too pleased about it, but Mr. Aizawa caught his smug smile and sent him a warning glare. "Why don't we take an evening stroll once the sun sets?" Toshinori asked carefully. Izuku's eyes shot up to meet his stepfather's eyes. He felt a smile grow on his lips. Usually, it was expected Izuku remained inside once the sun set. "That sounds wonderful," Izuku said, beaming with light, so much so that Toshinori's gaze instantly softened at seeing his boy's joy from the simple suggestion. "Would you join us, Mr. Aizawa?" Toshinori asked. "Of course, sir," he said and nodded his head compliantly. By the time the sun had set, Izuku was already standing eagerly ready at the front door. He had his dark blue cutaway tailcoat on with black and sturdy Hessian boots, outerwear fitting the late summer evening. While some warmth still lingered in the air, the wind often had a colder touch. Toshinori met him at the door with his long black cane with that intricate silver handle. Izuku had always thought his stepfather's cane looked beautiful, especially in the hands of the large gentleman who was well over 6 feet. He had it custom-made to fit his likings. Well, Izuku's mother had it made for him as a birthday present some years back, and he'd used it ever since. Mr. Aizawa stepped into the hallway right after. He was smothered in his large outing cape, but Izuku knew the man to be prone to feeling cold. Still, he could not help but chuckle at the sight of him buried in the large cape. They started their walk. First it was silent. Then Toshinori brought up the subject they'd all been fearing, Izuku's hunting. He was curious to know how much he knew, what he had learned and was capable of. That quickly started a wild conversation from Izuku that involved large arm movements and a dramatized language that made both of the older men chuckle. He waited patiently and affectionately for his child to finish before suggesting that they both might one day go hunting together. He mentioned a forest not too far away that was a famous hunting spot. That suggestion sent Izuku over the moon, making Toshinori absolutely melt from his son's excitement, completely forgetting about the sternness he'd first greeted the news of his son's activities with. They were walking away from the grounds alongside a dirt road. Izuku appreciatively took in the state of the lovely night. The moon was nearly full, shining brightly on the ground, no skies in sight and a gentle wind occasionally ruffling his hair. He sighed in contentment. They were all walking in comfortable silence as a noise grew louder nearby. They all turned to look attentively ahead of them where a small stone bridge led over the nearby brook, connecting the dirt road. In the distance, a wild and unruly carriage came into sight. It was led by 4 wild horses that ran as if their lives depended on it. They carried a huge black horse carriage that swerved on the road from the wilderness of it all. Izuku and his 2 companions halted in their steps and watched as the carriage approached rapidly towards the slightly curved bridge. Toshinori called out to warn them while Mr. Aizawa stepped protectively in front of Izuku. Suddenly the carriage jumped wildly into the air from the impact of the small, curved bridge, sending the whole party swerving into a nearby ditch. Izuku gasped in surprise, ducking under Mr. Aizawa's stern grip and hurrying closer to help. His father and teacher close at his heel. One of the passengers had been sent flying out of the carriage while others groaned from the inside. Izuku hurried to the unconscious young man lying on the ground. He was a beautiful blonde man with sharp features, and he looked positively peaceful as he lay on the ground, like he was simply sleeping. Toshinori went to the carriage to help out the passengers. A group of 4 people exited the broken carriage, 3 young men and a young woman. Several of their trunks of belongings had scattered down the road. "Are you all right?" Toshinori asked, concerned, helping the young woman to her feet. Izuku assessed them hurriedly. They were all really beautiful and almost enchanting, however he felt most drawn to the blonde whose head he gently cradled in his lap at the moment, trying to get him to wake up. "What happened? Why were you in such a hurry?" It is dangerous to move so fast during the night if you're unfamiliar with the territory. Toshinori lectured. Our apologies, we lost control of the vehicle. A man with red hair apologized. He was bleeding from his head. Where's your driver? Izuku asked, confused as he looked around and saw no one else. The four conscious exchanged looks before all turning to stare at him like he was mesmerizing. Izuku was thankful for the darkness of the night because he blushed at the sudden attention. He must have jumped off once the horses started acting up. A black-haired man sighed and shook his head confused. The blonde in Izuku's lap suddenly stirred and he looked into the most gorgeous ruby-red eyes he'd ever seen, ever so slightly lit up by the moonlight. Oh, hello. Izuku said, a bit embarrassed as the young man just stared at him. Are you all right? Izuku asked carefully as he took in the state of the young man, but he had no obvious wounds, just the disheveled look from someone that had been thrown off a speeding carriage. Mr. Aizawa helped the blonde off of Izuku, however the red eyes followed him intently as he stood back up. Where are you headed? Toshinori asked as he took in the strangers. Blackheart Manor. The red-headed guy said. Oh, that's not too far. Izuku remarked with an excited grin. I thought it was abandoned? He asked inquisitively. Not anymore. The beautiful blonde said. However, it probably needs more fixing up than the estate agent promised. His voice was husky, attention-grabbing almost. Izuku looked almost pleadingly at his father, who had anticipated the look in his eyes and grinningly shook his head. If you would like, we have room at our estate, while you heal from your injuries. Toshinori suggested. The woman smiled warmly. Much appreciated. She shot a look at the beautiful blonde, almost as if asking for approval before she continued. We would be honored and grateful to accept such an offer. While they were talking over the logistics, Izuku's attention was caught from the horses. 3 of them looked to be fine, but the 4th couldn't stand, and were constantly letting out painful noises. Izuku felt bad. He knew what had to be done to end its pain, so he didn't hesitate to move closer to it. He unhooked it from the other horses that had been forced into an uncomfortable position by the dead weight lying on the ground. He looked into those dark eyes of the majestic horse and smiled warmly at it before he brushed it gently over its mane. Then, in a quick movement, he moved his hands firmly around its neck. He'd never killed a horse before, but somehow, he knew just where to apply pressure to snap its neck. The loud snap and the screeching from the horse caused the conversation in the background to stop. The horse's blood had pooled around it from the many wounds, and had colored his hands dark red. He ignored the way they looked at him as he stepped back into their circle. While Izuku had been busy with the horse, Mr. Aizawa had been sent back to fetch help. Toshinori eyed his son carefully. He was shocked at the ease of which he managed to put the pained animal at peace, but he remained silent about it and instead turned back to the conversation he'd been having before Izuku's actions had attracted all of their attention. Izuku placed himself next to the blonde who eyed him with a mischievous glint in his eyes. It was funny. Something about the guy gave Izuku the weirdest sensation of warmth and recognition. The blonde elegantly pulled out a white handkerchief and gently took Izuku's hands before starting to wipe them clean. Izuku's eyes widened at the NTMT gesture, and his cheeks were glowing red. Thank you. He stammered as the blonde had finished cleaning both of his hands. The blonde smiled devilishly at him. Once again Izuku felt the prick of recognition. I'm Izuku Yagi Midoriya. He said nervously and hopefully held out his hand. The blonde gently took his hand, but not in a handshake. Instead, he cradled it and slowly brought it to his lips without breaking the eye contact. Katsuki Bakugu, he said after placing a warm kiss to his hand. Izuku was positively glowing from embarrassment and surprise. Katsuki grinned at him wickedly upon seeing the reaction. Izuku pulled his hand back with shock. Out of the corner of his eyes he saw a familiar carriage approaching. Mr. Aizawa and Mr. Yamada had brought a carriage to help carry their luggage since the black carriage the strangers had crashed in was in no condition to ever move again. Izuku was about to move, to help gather their scattered belongings when he felt a firm hand on his wrist, holding him back. He looked puzzled back at Katsuki. Say, have we met before? I feel oddly as if I already know you. Izuku pet his head askew and stared at the stranger. I feel the same way. It's silly, but when I was a kid I had this dream. Somehow you remind me of that. Izuku admitted. The blonde's smile grew more wicked and wider. You remind me of a dream too, a younger version of you though, screaming from a nightmare. I held you until you fell back asleep. Izuku's eyes widened as he took in the stranger again. He felt odd. Weirdly at ease, yet weirdly alert. Almost like he was prey, being lured into a false sense of security. Somehow, some part of him didn't mind the feeling. Young master, Mr. Aizawa demanded, and Izuku quickly pulled his arm to himself and looked innocently at his teacher who was eyeing the two of them suspiciously. Come along now, we should head back so you can get a proper night's sleep, he said. Izuku suddenly noticed how the four other strangers had very efficiently loaded their scattered trunks onto the carriage. While the carriage held the woman and two of the men, the red-haired guy hung back with Toshinori to help him with the horses they freed from the broken carriage, and Katsuki walked in Izuku's pace, not leaving his sight. Mr. Aizawa had settled onto the other side of Izuku and was constantly eyeing the stranger. So, Blackheart Manor, I suppose you'll be our new neighbors? Mr. Aizawa asked innocently. I suppose so, Katsuki said matter-of-factly. Izuku felt like he was caught in the middle of the two and their intense staring contest. He didn't like it. So, before any of them could say anything more, he ran ahead and jumped into the slowly moving carriage. The three strangers stared surprised at him as he entered their private chat. Hello, he said with a big smile. I'm Izuku Yagi Midoriya. It's nice to meet you all, he said. The woman broke into a sweet smile. It's nice to meet you too, Izuku. I am Mina, and this here is Hanta and Denki. Izuku shook hands with them all, beaming at the idea of becoming friends with the strangers. He took it as a good sign they introduced and spoke to him with first names. It felt like they were already close. So, what brings you out here? There's not much to do in the countryside, Izuku remarked. Mina chuckled a warm laughter. Oh, it's wonderful out here. I cannot wait to see your estate. The peace and quiet of the countryside are just what we all need, Denki remarked with a grin. So, how do you all know each other? Izuku asked. He had been itching to know how 5 people of around the same age were moving into an estate together. Oh, we're all friends and live together. Really? Izuku asked, intrigued. I've never heard of such a thing before, he remarked. The three exchanged looks. Well, mostly we just follow around Bakugo, Hanta said with a shrug. And it's fun to live with your friends. So, none of you are married? Izuku asked, shocked. He knew that most people his age were either married or looking to settle down. Not at all, we like the freedom of the single life, Denki said with a smug grin that made the other two giggle. Izuku didn't really understand but smiled kindly anyway. He was desperate to make friends, and even if the group seemed odd at times, he surprisingly liked their funny way of talking and comfortable atmosphere. They all seemed really close, and Izuku deeply envied that. He hoped to be able to infiltrate their group. They chatted the short way back to Toshinori's estate. From time to time Izuku glanced out the window on the carriage door and saw those beaming red eyes staring intensely back at him. Why don't you all get comfortable in the parlor room in the west wing? Izuku, please escort our guests. I'll make sure the trunks are carried to their rooms while we wait for the local physician to arrive, Toshinori ordered politely. Izuku smiled warmly at the group before gesturing for them to follow him. The West Wing was usually the guest wing, and they didn't spend a lot of time there despite it harboring the biggest lounging area in form of the Red Parlor, as Izuku called it. The room was lit by the fireplace and a few fine oil lamps, otherwise it was encased in almost macabre darkness. The room had been colored blood red from the tapestry. Every piece of imported furniture was draped with a rich velvet that sparkled in the light. The floorboards were covered in finely woven red carpets filled with intricate patterns. The room was like stepping inside a separate atmosphere. It was the only room in the house that had been so meticulously decorated in dark colors. Every other room had fine French pastel colors and flowery patterns priding the walls. I like this room, the red-haired guy named Kirishima stated as he ran his fingers over the plush sofa. The guests had barely sat down before the maids rushed in with trays of sweets and biscuits and warm milk, as well as cloth and fresh water to cleanse those that had endured wounds on their body. While the guests were tended to, Izuku stayed to the side, running his fingers alongside some of the old leather-bound books. He should explore this room more in the future, he thought. He had read just about every other book in the study and library, but for some reason his mind had long forgotten about this room. It was weird. Izuku usually wasn't one to forget his surroundings, especially inside the manor. He had inspected every inch of the place more than once, so to think he'd almost forgotten this room existed, it was peculiar. "Do you enjoy Voltaire?" A sudden gruff voice asked as Katsuki appeared beside him, noticing where his fingertips had lingered. "I've read a few of his tragedies, although I suppose they would be better if they were seen performed." "You don't get out often?" Katsuki asked softly. Izuku felt like he was melting in the voice and his fingertips tingled. "Not really. Besides, it's not as if there's a lot to see around here." Izuku huffed. "What do you like to do around here then?" he inquired, his eyes not wavering from Izuku once. Izuku felt like he was drowning from the intense attention Katsuki offered so freely, but for some reason he had no desire to try and reach the surface. He wasn't used to such attention. Sure, his usual companions blessed him with adoring affection and attention, but this seemed different. More intense. I suppose I like to read and hang around the garden," Izuku admitted shyly. Tashinori entered the room, closely followed by the local physician with a huge briefcase. Izuku recognized the physician. He came monthly to check on Izuku's health under Tashinori's orders. Instinctively he pulled towards the back of the room. Katsuki noticed the behavior and stepped between the doctor and Izuku as some sort of shield, despite the fact the physician wasn't even looking in his direction. "Not a fan of physicians, are you?" Katsuki asked with that mischievous grin. Izuku blushed from being caught in his avoidance. "I got sick once as a kid. Now my father makes sure I am checked at least once a month regularly no matter where we are. I just don't like being treated like I'm made of glass," Izuku admitted. He hadn't meant to tell Katsuki any of that, but somehow, he felt secure and comforted by his mere presence. "Really?" Katsuki asked with a teasing glint in his eyes. Izuku rolled his eyes sassily, making the other chuckle affectionately. He had never been one to tease his friends whenever he had them, perhaps out of fear they didn't like him enough to enter into that level of friendship. It was different with these strangers though. They might have thought nothing of it, but Izuku had been observant as an eagle, swallowing every detail about what a close friendship looked like. He noticed how this friend group were fond of teasing, laughing, and physical affection. Well, mostly the other four, even now, they huddled closely onto the large sofa while being examined, legs were recklessly crossing another person, arms hanging intimately around another shoulder, knowing exchanges of glances. The only odd one out was Katsuki. He, while somehow being the center of the group, was surprisingly the least interested in sharing such moments with his friends. While Izuku hadn't thought much of it earlier, his friends addressed him as Bakugu, while they all called each other by their first name. It was almost as if he was held in high regard within the group, like he was a leader of sorts. A sudden hand waved in front of Izuku's eyes as Katsuki snickered amused at him. "Spacing out, Izuku?" he asked. Izuku inhaled sharply from the surprise. "Oh, sorry," he said and bowed his head apologetically. "Tell me what you're thinking about, beautiful?" Katsuki almost whispered close to his ear, making Izuku freeze to his place and stare with his mouth agape. Be beautiful? Why was Katsuki calling him beautiful? Sure, his father addressed him as a handsome young man, and his mother called him a beautiful child, but a complete stranger addressing him as such, it did something to him. He felt a poke in his chest as thoughts raced away. He couldn't help but to nervously gnaw at his bottom lip as he had a tendency to do while thinking obsessively. Katsuki smiled warmly and guided his arm underneath Izuku's, gently pushing him in a direction. They settled in the small alcove by the window, a canopy stuffed with pillows and blankets. Izuku wondered why he hadn't sat there before. It was a wonderful place. The young man ran his fingertips over the satin coverings in wonder, looking like he was seeing his own house for the first time. The soft fabric of the upholstered alcove was much more delicate than that of the large curtains on either side of the opening. Izuku noticed not when he had sat down, nor when he curled his entire body into the space. He didn't even notice when the handsome stranger followed him and sat beside him. It was only when a bird flickered somewhere in the night, he became aware of how close they were sitting, their knees grazing unconditionally. Katsuki rested his head in his hand as he looked attentively at the young master of the house. "So, what were you thinking about?" he asked, repeated the question from several minutes ago, before Izuku had entered another one of those muttering trances. "I forgot," Izuku said and grinned widely, almost illuminating the shadowy room with the brightness of his smile. "I know we have not known each other for long, and I hope you won't be angry with me, but I dearly hope we could become exceptionally close. For some inexplicable reason I feel very drawn to you," Katsuki said, rubbing his neck bashfully, making Izuku stare in amazement of the shyness. He burst into a giggle before throwing himself over the blonde in a strong hug. "I would love to be friends," Izuku burst out, drawing the attention of the entire room. When he finally realized the growing sets of eyes seeking him out, he tried desperately to pull back. However, Katsuki, who at first had been too stunned to react, had closed his arms firmly around the other, relishing in the feeling of the hug, of the closeness. Izuku just shrugged it off and grinned to the onlooking crowd, enjoying being held like that. Eventually they all started looking away again, but Katsuki did not relinquish his hold, nor did he show any intention of ever doing so again. "Katsuki, can you loosen your grip a bit, so I can sit back down without basically sitting in your lap?" Izuku chucked wholeheartedly. "I don't mind you sitting in my lap," Katsuki stated seriously, making Izuku oddly happy, despite being aware that friends did not really sit in each other's laps. So, he simply laughed like it was a joke and managed to pry off Katsuki's strong fingers that had locked around his waist. Though Katsuki had stopped hugging him, he had immediately sought out Izuku's hands instead. "Tell me about your favorite memory," Katsuki demanded sweetly while playing with the freckled hands of his companion. So Izuku started telling the story of how he, his mother and Toshinori had been to a private viewing of a famous flamenco dancer when they lived in Barcelona. It was one of Izuku's favorite memories. The colors, the music, and the intensity of the movements from the performer had sent shivers down his spine. The entire evening had been magical. Izuku must have been 15 or so. It was one of the few parties Izuku had been allowed to attend throughout his life, and he had loved every second of it. Katsuki was a surprisingly good listener. It was very clear from his comments and questions he heard every word, and even more, he paid attention to his words like they were forged in gold. With such an attentive companion, Izuku could not help but to flourish. Oftentimes, Izuku kept quiet when the house received guests. If he did talk, he mostly felt uncomfortable, or strangers felt uncomfortable with him. When he got excited, he started making wild movements and speed-talking like he could barely breathe. He often got lost in thoughts and mumbled to himself. That left him with boring, polite conversations, and even if he did want to say something more, it often seemed like people did not want to listen, so he'd learned to be quiet. Being with Katsuki was different. Izuku had a strange sense of relief and ease when talking, and he couldn't stop himself. He had never felt his words were as appreciated as they were in Katsuki's presence. Katsuki, on the other hand, was enchanted by everything Izuku said and did. "You'll tire out our guest at this rate, Izuku." His stepfather laughed as he had closed in on them. "My apologies, Mr. Bakugu, my son easily gets overexcited, just tell him if it becomes too much." Izuku instantly shut up, looking through the window in embarrassment. "Oh, not at all. I would love to hear everything Izuku has to say," Katsuki said, meeting Izuku's green eyes with an unwavering gaze. "I could listen to him talk for days on end without getting bored." Izuku's eyes widened with surprise, and he grew even more red-faced as the handsome blonde squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Oh, well, all right then. Nevertheless, your rooms are prepared, and a proper night's sleep would benefit you both, considering the evening's events," Toshinori said and bowed before offering a good night's sleep to his guests and retreated from the room to escort the physician out. Wait. Izuku burst out and slid down from the windowsill. "Shouldn't the physician check out Katsuki as well?" Izuku asked, confused, remembering above all, to be a good host. "Oh right, of course," Tashinori chuckled. I nearly forgot all about it, seeing as he appears not to have been hurt. It is fine really, I do not need a checkup, I am quite all right. Katsuki said quickly. Please, I would feel such remorse if you'd been hurt and not gotten properly checked out. Izuku turned to him and pleaded. Katsuki looked like he wanted to be persistent in saying no, but found himself following the advice, simply to please Izuku. Izuku was biting his lip in nervousness while the examination took place. The other 4 guests exchanged unsure glances. Your heartbeat is unusually low, Mr. Bakugo. The physician commented after checking his pulse. It usually is. Katsuki said. Even so, I suggest proper nutrition and rest, otherwise you seem to have suffered no other damages from the crash, a miracle really. The physician commented and looked evaluating at him. It's quite all right, you can stay here as long as you need to recuperate. Tashinori assured the group. However, it has long since passed midnight, and I think we would all appreciate a good night's rest. Then he and the physician left. Mr. Aizawa was yawning as he started guiding the group to their appointed rooms. Izuku met Katsuki's piercing eyes once more. Sleep well, Katsuki. Izuku whispered as they left the room, and he turned down the hall towards the main staircase. Tashinori met him on the stairs. Seems like you got along well with our new guests. He remarked. Oh, I like them so much. Izuku whined in joy. You seem especially taken by young Mr. Bakugo? Tashinori asked with a raised brow. Katsuki is so nice. Izuku sighed in contentment. I hope we can become great friends. He turned to his father and hugged him tightly. Thank you for letting them stay here, he said with a broad smile on his lips. The older gentleman affectionately ruffled his hair and smiled back at him. Go to bed, Izuku. Our guests will need a well-rested guide for tomorrow to show them around the estate. Izuku whined with joy and shot towards the direction of his room. It felt too much like a coincidence the strangers appeared today of all days. However, Izuku was far too joyful to think further in depth about it. There were several things Izuku noted during the following days that seemed unusual about his new friends. Firstly, they slept in, often rising at around 1 o'clock in the midday. Secondly, they ate little to no food, often just nibbled at the dinner served, but drank a lot of fluids, water, hot cocoa, tea, apple juice, and whatever else was available in the household. Thirdly, they avoided the sun. They usually only went out during the day if it was cloudy or raining. On the few instances they'd come out. During the summer weather, they'd been wearing thick clothes and parasols to cover for the sun. More than anything, they seemed even drowsier on the sunnier days, whereas Izuku was jumping with energy. He thought all the habits were odd. However, they always provided good explanations, and Izuku liked them way too much to pressure them to talk about something they didn't want to talk about. Another thing he noted was the fact that no matter how many talks and chats he had with the group, he couldn't help but to feel as if he didn't know them at all. On the other hand, they knew everything there was to know about him. Sometimes they even spoke of instances he didn't think he had mentioned but shrugged it off as his own forgetful mind. Still, no matter how weird it got, Izuku was in awe of his newfound relations. Especially with Katsuki. The others were great, but it was Katsuki that really had done it for him. Almost no matter what the blonde said, Izuku found himself in great company. Even now, when sitting in the red parlor and reading some distasteful historical novel, his focus was hardly on the book. Katsuki lounged casually on the sofa next to him, mingling their feet together playfully. They didn't speak, but it was as if they didn't have to. For the first time in a long time, Izuku felt content. Well, of course that peace wouldn't last forever. Izuku! Tashinori burst into a room looking frantic. What happened, father? Izuku asked nervously, instantly correcting his posture and closing his book. My military comrade, Mr. Todoroki, has written to me. Gods, it is awful, I know you corresponded with his son often. He said, sitting down in a chair beside him, reaching over to take his hand. What happened? Izuku repeated, concerned. His body gradually became more tense with the gloomy atmosphere his father brought. His son, Shoto, he has been ill since you wrote him last. A horrible sickness. Oh no! Izuku gasped, eyes widening. Last week he succumbed to his illness and passed during the night. What? Izuku exhaled sharply. I'm so sorry, my son, Toshinori said and patted his hand affectionately in an attempt to cheer him up. But that can't be, Izuku started, but was unable to finish as his throat closed up and he tried swallowing down the tears. How could it be that he was so unfortunate? I need to go on a walk to clear my head, Izuku said and got up abruptly, not letting his company say anything more before he'd fled the room. Izuku was headed for the door, tears streaming down his face. Mr. Aizawa met him on the way, trying to inquire about his misfortunes, but Izuku barely heard his voice and just continued out of the house. He needed to go outside to gather his thoughts, and he wanted to be alone as he did so. He hadn't bothered with proper outerwear, and at that moment he couldn't care less. He stormed Trough the Gardens as fast as his legs would allow him to and headed straight for the old chestnut tree by the far end of the vegetable garden. It was cloudy and gray, almost like the weather conformed to Izuku's mood. He hoisted himself up and into the old branches of the sturdy tree before settling up high, where a thick branch had curled and offered a surprisingly comfortable seat. Izuku often liked to go there to be alone if he felt overwhelmed. When settled securely, Izuku let his emotions run free. Heartfelt sobs escaped his throat as he dried away the tears that kept on coming. He had never met Shoto in real life, but he felt as if he did. He felt as if a small part of his heart had been carved out. Shoto had been his first real friend in a long time, and their exchanged letters had brought him joy. Their conversations had been a way for him to escape and had offered him freedom with his words he often felt like he didn't have in the house. He mourned the friend he would now never meet and mourned the freedom their friendship had offered him. He was deep in sorrow as he noticed a flicker outside of the corner of his eyes. Katsuki. He hadn't heard him approaching, but there he was, standing right by the foot of the tree. His eyes looked painful and perhaps confused. Go away, Izuku hissed, hiding away his face. I want to be alone, he insisted when Katsuki didn't move. We don't have to talk, Katsuki said, his voice remarkably soft and tender. Izuku fleetingly met his gaze. It was more pleading than anything else, almost like the thought of seeing Izuku crying caused him physical pain. Will you come down or should I come to you? He asked, continuing in the soft voice that sounded like a choir of angels. When Izuku didn't answer, Katsuki started moving. When the blonde had secured himself on the branch, Izuku didn't dare meet his eyes. He didn't want his new friend to see him cry like a child. Katsuki didn't say anything. Instead, he inched himself forward until he was close enough to pull the crying young man into a hug. Izuku was relieved not having to meet his gaze. Instead, his watery face was pressed into the handsome man's chest, while he stroked Izuku's soft and curly hair. The comforting motion reminded Izuku of his late mother, and another storm of sobs overcame him. He clutched his fingers into the fabric of Katsuki's shirt, as if holding on to a lifeline. He found comfort in the soft touches, the warm embrace, and the overwhelming scent of burnt caramel and fire. They sat like that for a while, neither could probably tell for how long, and neither of them felt like letting go. When Izuku's sobs gradually trailed off, Katsuki pulled back a bit and cupped his face with those long and slender fingers of his. He didn't say anything at first, simply wiped away the glittering tears over Izuku's now puffy face. You are a kind person, Katsuki finally settled on after looking lost in thought for a long while. And I am sorry you had to endure this, he said and gently placed a small peck on his forehead. You shouldn't look at me right now, I am pitiful. Izuku sniffled, looking away. You're human, it is normal for humans to feel like this, Katsuki offered. It sounded odd the way he said it, like it was a foreign concept to him, but Izuku didn't pry. Although I rarely feel sorrow, I feel it now, when seeing your beautiful face contorted in such sadness. I do not want to see you cry for anyone but me, Katsuki continued and gently trailed his fingers over the nape of his neck in a calming manner. Izuku didn't know what that meant, and Katsuki must have noticed his confusion. I apologize, sometimes I forget myself in your presence, said, a faint blush creeping over his cheeks. What can I do to cheer you up? He asked, quickly collecting himself. I don't know. Izuku mumbled, adjusting his seat on the wide branch, finally realizing his body was not happy with him for sitting so long on such a hard surface. "Are you getting uncomfortable up here?" Katsuki asked, reading his behavior instantly, like an open book. Izuku blushed a little. Katsuki released his grip on him and started descending the tree, motioning for Izuku to follow. He almost felt cold when Katsuki's warmth wasn't present right beside him. Odd, he thought, and felt that small poke in his chest again. As Izuku was nearing in on the ground, he felt Katsuki's hands close around his waist to aid him. The strong hold made Izuku extremely self-aware, but he couldn't fool himself and say he didn't like the feeling it sent through his body. "Why don't we go for a walk? I spotted a lake not too far from here," Katsuki suggested, managing to hook his arm under Izuku's to guide him. They walked in a pleasant silence, only the sounds of the wildlife surrounding them. The wind that ruffled the leaves on the trees, the birds singing or fluttering through the air, even the way the ground crunched under their weight as they walked. Izuku had to admit he was already feeling much better. Just being in Katsuki's company uplifted his spirit. Izuku knew that he shouldn't wander off the property without informing his father or teacher, but today he did so anyway. It felt too easy to break the rules when Katsuki suggested it. Sometimes he came to the lake during the night, just watching it to ease his wandering mind. It was beautiful, but he'd only seen the lake in its glory during the day on few occasions. Even so, despite the gray weather, it was stunning. Both him and Katsuki stopped to take in the sight in its glory. He took a deep breath to fill out his lungs and smelled the earth and plants all around him. Katsuki had meanwhile wandered off to the nearby platform at the edge of the water. "Izuku, there's a rowboat," Katsuki called back excitedly. Izuku tried to hide his smile at his companion's joy as he walked closer towards him. Katsuki had already started trying to get himself into the smaller rowboat, making the whole thing sway under his weight. "Katsuki, I don't think you should do." "Wawa." Katsuki yelped as the rowboat moved in the water and sent him flying over the edge, crashing into the water. Izuku was raging with laughter as the blonde hair appeared from the surface, and Izuku started laughing even more, holding his stomach in an attempt to stop the cramping his laughter caused his body. "Is not funny." Katsuki grumbled, annoyed as he got to the platform's edge and started hoisting himself up. Izuku's laughter stilled as time seemed to halt. His eyes widened and heartbeat quickened as he took in the sight of Katsuki's majestic form. Now, drenched in water, his clothes stuck to his form like glue, illuminating every curve and muscle. The ways his arms flexed from moving his weight onto them, the way his shirt was stuck to his disgustingly chiseled abs, even the way his now wet hair became untangled from its styling and went into wild spikes, all of it sent Izuku into an ungodly spiral of unusually lustful thoughts. His entire body became hot and weird from the sight, and Katsuki didn't even seem to realize as Izuku visually gulped in surprise. Katsuki was too concerned with wringing the water from his shirt to notice how the exposed sliver of skin from his raised shirt sent Izuku's heart into overload, and he had to support himself on the rails onto the platform to stop himself from collapsing. What on earth was happening to him? This had never happened before. Sure, he had lusting thoughts as other youths, but nothing like this, nothing so distastefully ungodly. The way he wanted to lick the fair skin of his friend, wanted to bite into it, great heavens. Despite never having been especially religious, he felt as if he had to offer a penance and pray to rid himself of such sinful thoughts about his friend. God, he was ashamed, even more ashamed that he wasn't really ashamed. For the first time in perhaps his entire life, he felt as if he saw something he wanted to own, demed be whoever might get in his way. "Are you all right? You look sick?" Katsuki asked, concerned, stepping closer. Izuku held out a warning hand, aware he had to compose himself before the other got too close. "Yes, thank you, I'm quite all right, just choked on my laughter from seeing your foolishness." He lied effortlessly. Another unusual thing for him, he rarely lied. God, what on earth was happening to him? Katsuki grinned boyishly, looking even more handsome. My God, he had to stop before cluelessly giving the other a heart attack. We should get back before you catch a cold. Is my darling worried about me? Katsuki teased as he walked closer, slinging one of those wonderfully muscly arms around his shoulders. Izuku didn't dare look at him, so he offered a simple huff. As if. He answered while burning brightly, aware that the deliciously looking abdomen was pressed against his side. Heavens, this was the cruelest torture he'd ever felt. The pure restraint he had to showcase made him sweat. I don't know why you're the one acting weird, I'm the one who embarrassed myself and fell into the water. Katsuki pouted. I did succeed in making you smile though. He whispered, perhaps mostly to himself. Izuku suppressed a grin. He had made a fool of himself to cheer him up? That was so thoughtful, so nice, so attractive. No, not this again. What was going on with his mind? It had never betrayed him like this before. He cursed himself under his breath for his own primitive impulses. Are my ears betraying me or did you just curse Izuku? Katsuki teased and gave him an affectionate squeeze. Must have been your imagination. Izuku persisted, still not daring to meet his gaze. Sounded like music to my ears though. Katsuki confessed. I like it when you curse. Great heavens! Had Katsuki single-handedly decided to make Izuku lose his mind? Gods, he was adding fuel to the fire by those constant flirty remarks. He felt like smacking him and kissing him at the same time. It was frustrating. If he hadn't been constantly monitored by the beauty on his side, he would have already plucked himself bald from stress. I'm getting cold, Katsuki said, trying to catch Izuku's eyes, though the other refused to entertain it. It won't be long. Can't you give me a hug to keep me warm? Katsuki suggested innocently. Finally, Izuku met his eyes, and they were anything but innocent. He made a grimace before continuing on. That's not funny. He muttered. Never said it was. Katsuki shrugged. Come on darling, be a good host. Izuku sighed overdramatically to hide his own SXL frustration before turning to Katsuki and hugging him tightly. God, Katsuki was such a liar, he was burning hot, even despite being drenched and leaving a trail of water behind him. That's more like it. Katsuki almost purred in satisfaction right by Izuku's ear, making him flinch involuntarily. Someone had to end his misery soon before he gave into his fantasy, but it went against every fiber within his body to act out of selfishness in this way when he knew it was wrong. Especially since he had no idea what Katsuki thought. For all Izuku knew, this was how everyone acted with their closest friends, and he was reading the situation wrong. Liar! Izuku huffed disapprovingly and pushed Katsuki off him before setting straight back into a fast-paced walk. He heard Katsuki's laughter rumble in the background as he caught up with him. I didn't know you could be so sassy. I like this side of you. Katsuki admitted with a grin. Izuku opted out of answering, not trusting one single fiber of his body nor his mind at the moment. What? Giving me the silent treatment now? Katsuki asked, reaching out and brushing his fingers against Izuku's neck, involuntarily making him shudder. Izuku looked embarrassed by his reaction to the simple gesture, but Katsuki looked wildly pleased, like he loved seeing Izuku squirm under his touch. Ah, Izuku, what's going? My God, what happened to the two of you? Mr. Yamada asked, confused as he was exiting the small tool shed. Katsuki fell into the lake. Izuku stated flatly, not trying to get into details about why he had become partly wet along the way, from Katsuki's relentless physical contact. The lake, what were you doing down there? Just going for a walk, Izuku said, rubbing his neck nervously. Anyways, I should get Katsuki back to his room before he gets sick, he said, starting to push away the blonde in the direction of the mansion, now within sight. Ah, how lovely you worry about me, Katsuki said in an overly sweet voice. But don't worry, I am the perfect picture of health, he insisted. Izuku chose not to go into a discussion with Katsuki, knowing the blonde loved riling him up too much. Right now, his one and only goal was to get Katsuki shoved back into his room so he could run off and lock himself into his own room while sorting through his thoughts. His head had felt muddled with unusual emotions the whole way back, and he knew it became obvious in his snappy remarks and sarcastic tone. This mostly happened when he had a lot going on inside his head and he forgot all about good manners and proper etiquette. He was a bit distraught to have shown this undesirable side of himself so quickly. He had been taught that proper manners and politeness was what mattered upon meeting new people. It annoyed him that Katsuki of all people seemed to draw out the more emotional and raw comments he usually hid away. "My gods, what happened to you too?" Toshinori asked, shocked, as he nearly clashed with them around the corner of the main staircase. "Don't even ask." Izuku sighed, once again forgetting his manners. Katsuki was grinning widely, and even Izuku couldn't suppress his smile any longer over the ridiculous situation. Toshinori had been about to go on a rant, but upon seeing the relaxed and happy smile on his son's face, he halted. The last state he'd seen him in had been one warped in grief, but now here he was, already back in a good mood. Toshinori locked eyes with Katsuki and nodded once, showing his appreciation as the tension in his shoulders eased up. Upon entering the West Wing and finding Katsuki's room, Izuku was about to shove him in and turn on his heel, when he felt a sharp grip around his collar. "Where do you think you're going, darling?" Katsuki asked with a loaded tone. Izuku swallowed before turning to stare innocently at him. "To my own room. I'm tired," he said, the only excuse he could think of. "Oh well, that's no issue. You can sleep here while I bathe," Katsuki said, pulling him further into the room. "What?" Izuku asked in shock. "Do you not want to? Don't you like me anymore?" Katsuki asked with positively the biggest puppy eyes Izuku had ever seen, and he was certainly not expecting said eyes to belong to those of the somewhat intimidating guy. "What? Of course I still like you. But that does." "Good, then lay down while I take a bath," Katsuki insisted as his grip around Izuku's collar tightened, and in a quick movement he had turned and swept Izuku off his feet, literally. Izuku fell on his back, landing onto the mattress with Katsuki towering over him. Izuku felt once again how time seemed to still around them as he locked onto those forever deepening red eyes. They showed signs of every possible shade of red, some even looked orange. It was almost like they had a life of their own, constantly flickering like flames. Izuku could look into them for hours without growing bored. Had it not been for the pressure he felt around his neck, not uncomfortable but not natural either, he wouldn't have redirected his attention. Katsuki's hand was warm and locked around his neck, like it was keeping him in place. It horrified Izuku to admit to himself he found it kind of nice. "Don't move," Katsuki hummed, a few inches away from his face, looking pointedly at him, before easing his grip and backing away into the bathroom. Only when the door closed behind him did Izuku dare to let out an exhilarated breath. What on earth was that? Izuku moved, feeling a bit rebellious, but not enough to leave the room. Instead he scurried around the bed and buried his face in a pillow that held Katsuki's lingering smell. He hadn't been tired despite his earlier excuse, but somehow, he felt incredibly comfortable and drowsy now. He liked the fact that Katsuki had no need or intentions of calling up a maid to help him bathe. He wasn't sure he liked the idea of anybody else getting a good look at the blonde's sculptured body. Since when had he been so possessive? It was natural for Izuku to want to share things in his life with the people around him, but for some reason he felt irked at the thought of sharing Katsuki with anybody else. He smothered his face in the pillow and could barely breathe, but it was worth it. For being able to linger in the scent secretly. Eventually his mind settled, and the constant feeling of familiarity pushed him into dozing off slightly. When Izuku awoke again, he felt the prickle in his neck from being observed. In the corner of the room sat a fully clothed Katsuki Bakugo, slouching in an armchair, staring directly at him with that intense gaze. "You moved," Katsuki noted. It took Izuku's clouded mind a while to catch up. "So what?" he pushed teasingly, still a bit groggy. Katsuki's eyebrow twitched in amusement. Izuku felt a bit brave. Maybe it was some lingering grogginess that allowed him the freedom to speak without restraint. "I like your hair better when it's spiky," he said, noting the blonde had tamed his hair after the bath to its usual perfection. Katsuki shot Izuku a predatory grin, revealing some surprisingly sharp teeth in the meantime. He looked pleased that Izuku complimented him but didn't outright answer. "You should get something to eat, it's about dinner time anyway," Katsuki remarked. "So should you," Izuku retorted. "I was planning on it." Katsuki chuckled darkly. In spite of Katsuki's response, he didn't eat much at dinner. However, Izuku had come to expect this from his friends, and didn't think anything of it. Instead, he focused on filling up his own empty stomach until he was satisfied. The evening, he spent playing chess with Kirishima and chatting with the group. Katsuki kept himself at a distance, although Izuku was well aware he was being carefully observed. He went to bed early that night, so he had time to think over the day's events. He was astonished by himself and concluded that something must be wrong with him from the many confusing impulses he'd experienced through the day. By the time he blew out his bedside candle, he was exhausted from dissecting his own thoughts and fell asleep. He slept a while, though he had no idea how long, when he was startled awake by a sound and shot up in his bed. He took in the state of his room, nothing amiss, but he couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling in his mind. He felt as if he was being watched although he was alone. He triple-checked the room before he hid himself under his covers and moved closer to the wall behind him. He had shivers running down his spine and wondered why his brain was playing tricks on him. He had a hard time falling asleep after that, but eventually he did though. He drifted off to a nightmare about the incident when he was a kid, and the feelings lingering from the event made the sleeping young man shiver. Unbeknownst to Izuku, something watched him shiver in fear. Something rejoiced in watching the sleeping man curl up in his bed, the way the bedspread cradled his body and curved alongside it, making every sleepy JRK visible for the watcher. "Have you heard?" Toshinori asked with a troubled sigh. "Heard what?" Izuku asked carefully. They found a big stag in the forest gutted right open, like it had been eaten by a monster. They think a wolf might be lurking in the area or a bear, so I would like you to stay away from the forest for a while. Toshinori warned. "But this whole place is surrounded by forest, I can't just..." "You will not wander off to the forest, that is the end of it." Toshinori hissed angrily. Izuku looked furious, but sat back down in a controlled movement, not letting his emotions get the best of him. He dared not point out the fact that there had been wolves in the area before, and that despite his many run-ins with them, they'd never exhibited any kind of aggressive behavior towards Izuku. "Can I still go with my friends to see their new place? They want to check on the renovations." Izuku asked, suppressing his feelings. Toshinori furrowed his brows. "I should think not. There's lots of forest between the two estates." "Father!" Izuku burst out frustrated as he stood from his chair. "Sit down, Izuku, I am not being unfair, but if there really is a dangerous animal on the loose in the area, I should like not to take any chances." Izuku, for once, refused to follow the order, and he watched as Toshinori's face became contorted in shock that he dared directly protest against his order. Mr. Aizawa had hastily gotten up from his seat in the corner as the tension was rising in the room, almost causing the air to vibrate. He looked worriedly between the two. It was rare that the two of them fought openly. They might disagree or use Mr. Aizawa as a mediator, but especially Izuku never rebelled directly to Toshinori's face like this. "Sit down," Toshinori repeated. Izuku, who was still standing with fingers curled into fists, stared defiantly back into his stepfather's eyes. "No, I don't want to sit anymore," he said coldly, an unusual edge to his voice. "Excuse me?" Toshinori asked, getting up from his own chair. The two stared relentlessly at each other, like wild animals sizing each other up. "I am careful, you know I am. Now I intend to go with my friends for the day and be back before nightfall. We will stay on the main roads and not venture off into the forest, but I am going whether you like it or not," Izuku said harshly. Toshinori looked fuming, like he'd just been slapped. "I said no." "Mr. Yagi, what if we..." Mr. Aizawa began, but was hastily stopped. "Do not interrupt me." Toshinori burst out and snapped his head around to the teacher, who respectfully bowed his head in obedience. "Gosh, this is the influence of your new friends, right? You've never been like this before," Toshinori said, looking a bit manic as he locked his sight back on Izuku. Normally, he would have backed down long ago, but for some reason he couldn't. "No," Izuku stated. "I would have just done it in secret anyway, no matter what you said." His eyes were cold and certain as he stared into those of his stepfather. "I thought we were evolving," Izuku said, his voice turning soft. "I thought things had gotten better between us, but it is clear you still intend to keep me locked away here no matter what I do," he said, voice breaking halfway through, but he refused to cry. He was strong. He looked hurt because he was, but he remained upright and didn't cower away. "Those promises of us going hunting together sometime, were they also lies?" Izuku asked, putting his head askew. His stepfather flinched, a wave of uncertainty. "Izuku, you know I only do this to keep you safe." Toshinori protested and reached out towards his son, who instantly stepped back, keeping just out of reach. "Don't make me hate you, please?" he pleaded, looking back to his stepfather, who was looking more lost by the second. Like this whole conversation had taken a turn he hadn't expected or even thought possible between them. "I can take care of myself, you know I can. I'll be back by dinner." Izuku sighed and left the room before any of them had a chance to protest. His 5 new friends were standing ready in the courtyard, having borrowed a carriage from Toshinori's estate, and were now ready to leave. It was clear they'd been waiting for him, and looked a bit concerned upon seeing his deflated attitude. "Everything all right?" Mina asked, concerned. Izuku shrugged the feeling off his shoulders and smiled cheekily. "I'm looking forward to see your future house." He smiled. "Oh, it's more than just a house," Denki stated proudly. A couple days after they first arrived, the group had visited the abandoned grounds. Ever since they'd been ceremoniously back and forth between the 2 estates, since a lot had to be fixed before they could officially move in, and Toshinori had been more than welcoming to extend their stay at his estate. Izuku hadn't seen it yet though, but he was looking forward to it. The property would be back to its glory by the end of the next month according to Katsuki. Izuku had no idea how extensive the damage had been, but seeing as it was possible to fix it up as quickly, he thought perhaps it hadn't been too bad. Izuku was excited though. He had no idea what to expect. He had only seen the estate in passing, and never more than a quick glance or mention by rumor. "What are you thinking of, darling?" Katsuki leaned in and asked, making Kirishima whistle suggestively and the others laugh at the sudden intimacy. Izuku blushed under the attention of their teasing, but Katsuki sent one quick and ferocious glance that made all of them quiet down. Sometimes Izuku forgot how intimidating the blonde could be, since he never really was around Izuku. "Just wondering what it'll look like." He mumbled and ran his fingers alongside the lining of the seat. He usually had his fingers fiddling with something, most of the time unknowingly. "What do you think of a ball?" "A ball?" Izuku asked, confused. "You do like parties, do you not?" Katsuki teased. "A party?" Mina burst out excitedly. "But you hate parties, Bakugu." Siro mumbled, confused. Katsuki shot him a look that made him comically close his mouth and look away. "I haven't been to a lot of them," Izuku admitted, embarrassed. "But it sounds fun." An innocent blush spread alongside his cheekbones, making Katsuki's smile grow wider in extension. "I will throw you the best party you'll ever experience," he stated matter-of-factly. "Oh, you don't have to do it for me," Izuku squeaked. "Of course we do," Mina said and threw her arms around him. "You're becoming one of us. We need to celebrate." "Are really?" Izuku asked happily. "You don't mind having me around?" "Are you kidding? You're so gentlemanly," Kirishima insisted. Though Izuku hadn't heard that term used in such a passionate manner before, he gladly accepted it. Mina leaned in closer. "Besides, Bakugu is completely smitten with you." Her words caused him to wildly stare, before an embarrassing hiccup started taking over his body. She grinned at him, but Izuku couldn't even force himself to raise his stare from the ground. He wasn't sure what to say or do, not even sure if it was true. Katsuki's slender fingers reached out and gently directed Izuku's chin toward the window. "Look," he commented softly. Izuku stared in awe as a huge mansion came into view up ahead. It was beautiful. He noted how many workers were around, and how swiftly they worked. He had never seen anything like it before. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, where the driver elegantly opened the door and offered his hand to accompany the group down the step. However, when it was Izuku's turn, as he was the last to leave the carriage, he noticed how Katsuki, not very discreetly, shoved the driver away and offered his own hand for support. Izuku glanced at the surprised driver and then back at Katsuki, who was smiling confidently at him. His hand was warm against Izuku's, like fire. Though the touch shouldn't have taken more than a second, it felt like it lasted a lifetime when their eyes connected. "Stop eyeing each other," Denki teased, instantly making Izuku squirm from the word and wildly pull his hand to himself while blushing like an innocent kid. Katsuki sent a deadly glare over his shoulder, instantly stopping the erupting laughter from the rest of the group. Izuku was embarrassingly aware that he was much more innocent than the rest of the group. Despite them looking like they were around the same age, Izuku felt like they'd experienced much more of life than him. Maybe it was another side effect from being anchored to Toshinori's property whenever they moved, but Izuku had never had the opportunity to experience and explore like they had. Sometimes they talked to each other using filthy words Izuku had never thought to string together before. He got uncomfortable, not so much from the words, more so from his own inexperience. Perhaps that was also why he had no idea how to receive whatever affection he was granted by Katsuki. "Why don't you go on ahead, you gauche creatures?" Katsuki sneered coldly to his crew. The four of them lowered their heads as they shuffled away. "That was not very nice, Katsuki," Izuku corrected and tugged at his sleeve. Katsuki's angry stare softened upon landing on Izuku. "You're too kind. Sometimes the Hellions need reprimanding," he stated. "Can you explain your whole group dynamic to me, Katsuki? I've seen your interactions for a while now, but it almost seems like you're some sort of leader for them or something. Why is that?" Izuku asked, putting his head askew as he observed Katsuki with those wide eyes brimming with curiosity. Katsuki melted in those inquisitive eyes. He gently weaved his fingers between those of the freckled man that had been fiddling with his sleeve for a while now. "It's kind of hard to explain," he said as he tugged Izuku forward, motioning for them to start the tour while talking. "I suppose I was the one to get them all together. None of them knew each other before I introduced them." "How did you meet them?" Izuku inquired, trying not to focus too much on the way his body was starting to heat up from holding hands with his friend. "I met Denki first. Our families were close, so when I set off to travel, he joined," Katsuki said, biting his lip, looking lost in thought. "Then we met Kirishima. He came from the gutter, a real bad part of town, but somehow we sort of clicked," Katsuki mumbled. "Then Zero, we met him on a boat where he was working as a crew member, and last is Mina. She too came from a poor home. She worked her butt off as a maid, but had a hard time keeping a job, and she was ecstatic about getting an opportunity to leave that place." "Sounds unusual," Izuku muttered and started mumbling to himself, before Katsuki gave his hand a squeeze, signaling for him to speak aloud. It was something he'd started doing, and Izuku quite liked it. "Well, not only are you all from different social classes, but different countries as well, right? I've noticed your differences in mannerisms and dialects, though I am impressed by how well you guys can disguise it when need be." Katsuki looked surprised by Izuku's observation before he slid into a sneaky smile. "I'm guessing Mina is originally French, right? She's got that dialect, and since she's the newest member of your group, I'm assuming she hasn't had as long to adjust. Zero is difficult. My guess is Prussia, or at least somewhere they speak German, but they speak German everywhere nowadays. Kirishima, I assume from Scandinavia, Norway maybe? He's got that red hair and certain way of pronouncing words that reminds me of a Norwegian man, but I'm in no way certain. You and Denki, however, you're obviously Slavic of some kind. I don't think you're from the Russian Empire, maybe Bohemia or the Kingdom of Hungary." Izuku asked, energetic from all of the puzzling information he tried to piece together in his head. Katsuki let out a roaring laughter at seeing his excitement. "You got it mostly, though not Kirishima. He's from Scotland. However, since he grew up poor, his accent is very different from those of noble descent." Izuku pouted, a bit embarrassed to guess Kirishima's descent so incorrectly. "So, you and Denki, where are you from?" "The Great Kingdom of Hungary," Katsuki said in a roaring laughter like the country in itself was a joke. "You don't like your birthplace?" Izuku asked wearily. "It is a horrid place. It's the place where I was born and died, so to speak," Katsuki grumbled. "Nothing but bad memories of my childhood home." Izuku couldn't help himself and fiercely grabbed a hold of Katsuki before surrounding him in a hug. Katsuki's overdramatic reaction to the place told Izuku all he needed to know. The place had hurt him deeply. All those wild laughs and animalistic eyes revealed easily to Izuku that it was a place best long forgotten. Katsuki froze at the sudden embrace. He had not expected it, certainly not from Izuku, who was about as nervous as a deer being hunted whenever Katsuki initiated contact. To feel the warmth and liveliness, the comfort, seeping off Izuku in thick waves of pleasant calmness, it did something funny to Katsuki. He buried his nose in the crook of his neck and smelled that luring fresh scent that clung to Izuku so desperately. Hell, he smelled delicious. Are you liking my neck? Izuku chuckled, apparently he was ticklish. Katsuki pulled stunned back with reddened cheeks. Just teasing. He plastered on a mischievous grin to hide his surprise at his own lack of restraint. What's wrong? Izuku asked, gently cupping Katsuki's face, which had now become severely depressing to look at. What an unusually quick shift in humor. I'm getting impatient. Katsuki admitted, letting out a half-growl Izuku didn't know what meant. What for? Izuku asked, once again putting his head askew, flashing a piece of that untouched neck. Your party? Katsuki said with a half-hearted smile and stepped back. I think I am getting hungry. Why don't Mina show you around while I find something to eat? Katsuki grinned. He didn't even call out before Mina suddenly appeared from around the corner, as if she'd been called. Katsuki massaged his temples as he stepped back. He looked tired. Izuku was confused by the whole situation. Most of all, he was worried about Katsuki, who looked like he had suddenly fallen ill mid-conversation. Izuku, dearest, why don't I show you the ballroom? Mina chuckled warmly as she guided him away from Katsuki, that now was resting against the wall. Will he be okay? Of course, my dear, he is just being careful. He can get a bit cranky if he's hungry. Maybe he should start eating more. You guys never eat during dinner. Izuku reprimanded her and made her chuckle. We have attuned our palates over time, which is why we prefer certain foods, and we always bring it ourselves, so please don't think we try to insult you if we appear to not eat enough. It is simply because we've already eaten. Well, can I do anything to help? Maybe if you told me what it is, why? None. You are not permitted to be tainted. Mina said suddenly, almost like she was repeating an order. I am sorry? Izuku asked, confused. Mina sighed confusedly, before she shook her head and put on a gentle smile. She pulled Izuku closer in her arms and cradled him affectionately. Seems like we're all becoming reckless since we like ya so much. She mumbled, mostly to herself, but Izuku heard her anyway, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. Sometimes the group spoke in a way that left out half of the words, so Izuku was left in confusion. Usually if he asked more about it, they managed to divert the conversation before he noticed it. Dance with me, dearest. Mina suddenly chuckled before she flew into action across the wide boarded floors where old, embroidered tapestries hung alongside the high walls and covered the place in intricate designs. Izuku could almost hear the music playing in his ears and feel the vibration under his boots, as if he was already at a party. He closed his eyes and joined Mina's laugh as they carelessly swung over the floors of the huge room, jumping around like children and spinning into each other's arms. At some point, Izuku didn't even notice when, but at some point, Shiro, Denki and Kirishima joined them, happily fooling around to the imaginary music, bowing to the imaginary crowd and swirling between each other. Izuku truly felt happy alongside his friends. As the sun started to lower and Katsuki still hadn't rejoined them, Shiro informed Izuku that he would meet them back at Toshinori's estate since he had been called into town to attend some business in the middle of his meal. Toshinori was quiet when they returned, and Izuku was unsure of what to tell his father, since their last encounter had been an argument. He didn't want to pick up where they left off. In a room full of people, so he waited until their guests drew to the red parlor. Izuku lingered back in the dining room with his father. Mr. Aizawa shot both of them a curious glance. Why don't you take the rest of the night off, Mr. Aizawa? Toshinori said. The teacher nodded and left the room. The maids were running in and out with the leftover food and cutlery to clear the place, so Izuku didn't feel it was the right atmosphere. "Father, why don't we talk in the library?" Izuku asked and got up from his chair. Toshinori followed him silently as he led the way and sat down in his armchair with a sigh. He was missing his usual perfect posture and looked somewhat deflated. Izuku noted that for once the elder seemed to be at a loss for words. "I am sorry I left in such a way earlier," Izuku admitted. "I was frustrated, but I could have handled it more maturely." Toshinori met his eyes, and finally Izuku seemed to notice how exhausted he really looked. In his eyes, his father was always beaming with energy and a perfect example of how a noble should act, how a man should be, but it was obvious the man was tired and had been for some time. Ever since Inko had died, his father had lost some of his spark. Izuku had been too far engrossed with his own emotions and feelings to properly notice. He cursed himself for his own negligence and selfishness. Izuku moved closer until he sat right next to the man. "I am sorry I have been more reckless recently. I know you're all just worried, and I know how scared you are to lose me," he said quietly and laid his hand on his father's. "No, you shouldn't apologize, Izuku. I know I can be overbearing," Toshinori said, clutching his hand tightly. "I guess I am just afraid to let you go into the world, afraid to accept that you're a grown man now and can make decisions for yourself." A silence spread between them for a moment, allowing them both to muster up the courage to speak any further. "You know that I love you, right? And I will always love you," Izuku said, looking into those blue eyes that held such sorrow in them. "How about we go on that hunting trip tomorrow?" Toshinori asked, a faint smile on his lips. "I would like that," Izuku admitted. "And while we're at it, why don't you start teaching me some self-defense? That way if I ever encounter a dangerous situation I can take care of myself. Would that give you a peace of mind?" Izuku suggested. Toshinori reached out and dragged his son into a deep hug. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, and I suppose it's fitting we lift the restrictions on your whereabouts, but I would like it if you would tell me or Mr. Aizawa before going out. How does that sound?" Izuku drew back surprised and stared into his father's face in disbelief. "Really? You really mean that?" I think it is time for me to let you grow to the wonderful young man I know you can be, and if you can defend yourself, that would certainly put my mind somewhat at ease," Toshinori admitted. Izuku fell over his father in a deep hug and clutched him close. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you," he repeated hastily, brimming with joy. "How was your day then? Seeing young Mr. Bakugu's new property?" "Oh, it was wonderful, father," Izuku squealed as he began telling him everything about the manor and how beautiful it was, despite certain places still being under renovation. They talked until the sun went down, and by then his father had to excuse himself and go to his room for the night. Despite Izuku's ecstatic energy, he too went to his room, intent on sketching out what he could remember of the property to calm his mind. Izuku was half changed out of his clothes, deeply focused on his sketch of the ballroom and the way they'd been dancing around in it, when a sudden knock at his door disturbed him. Izuku was a bit confused as he pulled himself out of the chair. He was not expecting company, and assumed the others had gone to bed. "Katsuki?" Izuku asked, surprised. The blonde looking like he was brimming with energy, a big contrast to the state he'd last seen him in. "Would you like company?" Katsuki asked innocently. Sure, I wasn't really doing anything anyway," Izuku said, opening the door for him. Katsuki looked relaxed and comfortable. He wasn't wearing stiff garments as usual, but the simple linen shirt with pantaloons. The shape of the pantaloons highly accentuated the muscled legs underneath, and the linen shirt flowed loose, allowing some collarbone to be visible. Izuku had to look away before his thoughts swept him away. He imagined he himself was a mess in comparison. He too had shed the outer layers of clothing, though his neckcloth was still wrapped around his neck. "So, you seem to be feeling better," Izuku pointed out awkwardly as Katsuki curiously looked around his room. He felt very much on display as Katsuki investigated the room with his blazing red eyes. It was nothing much and looked perhaps a bit disheveled from Izuku's tendency to forget what he was doing and beginning a new project. Books and paper were scattered. Ink bottles and fountain pens as well as some ink splotches on the table showed his chaotic use of the tool. Some clothes had been discarded on a chair in the corner, and his boots had been visibly thrown onto the floor. "I am feeling better, thank you," Katsuki said, not waiting for an invitation before he sat down on Izuku's bed in a casual demeanor that made Izuku's cheeks flush. So, what did you want to talk about?" Izuku asked nervously, still standing uncomfortably in the middle of the room, not sure where to place himself. The atmosphere seemed oddly NTMT, and he wasn't sure what to do or how to act in such a situation. "Nothing much, I just missed you." Katsuki shrugged casually. "Sit down, I won't bite," he then said with a teasing glint in his eyes that made Izuku gulp. He moved slowly across the room, aware he was being watched like prey, before he settled on the edge of the bed, furthest away from the other. "So, how did your business in town go?" Shiro said something came up. "Oh, nothing wild, it was just some of the contracts with the workers," he said casually and leaned back, supporting himself with his arms. He glanced over at the rigid young man next to him. Izuku didn't dare meet his eyes, he was so unsure of what to do. "Are you avoiding me?" Katsuki asked quietly, grazing his fingertips alongside Izuku's thigh. "And not at all," Izuku stammered. In one swoop motion Katsuki pulled at the hem of his shirt, yanking him onto the bed until he found himself sprawled across it, laying face to face with the blonde. "Much better," Katsuki said satisfied. Izuku's eyes widened in disbelief. He didn't dare move or look away, almost scared of what would happen if he did. So, he held the intense gaze and didn't back down. Katsuki's smile grew wider at this, but he didn't say anything. Instead he slowly reached out and caressed a loose curl from Izuku's hair, around his finger in a mesmerizing motion. "You're the most beautiful creature I've ever beheld," Katsuki stated with unshaken certainty in his voice. Izuku had come to terms with his face being a constant color of red since the other entered the room. Nevertheless, he felt the blush darken at the compliment. "Don't lie to me," Izuku almost whispered. "I would never lie to you, my dear," Katsuki whispered back. "And I'll never leave you either." "You won't." "Never? And you? Will you leave me?" "Of course I wouldn't," Izuku said determined, almost offended the other would have to ask. They might not have known each other for that long, but he felt such a deep connection to the other he couldn't even imagine his life without his presence anymore. Katsuki smiled softly, sincerely. "Promise?" he asked, holding out his pinky. Izuku made a grimace at the childish gesture, before he chuckled and hooked his own pinky to the other. "I promise. The promise won't last until we seal it with a kiss," Katsuki insisted quietly. Izuku felt his heartbeat quicken. "What? A kiss?" Katsuki repeated. "Have you ever been kissed before?" "No." Izuku muttered embarrassed and looked at their two pinkies, still intertwined. "Would you like me to?" Katsuki asked. A blush spread dutifully on his cheeks, but he refused to look away. Izuku's body became hotter and hotter, signaling quite clearly to his mind what it wanted, but Izuku was scared. He was scared of what it meant, if it even meant anything but something as silly as sealing their promise. He was scared to take that leap into the unknown. However, Izuku was many things. Nervous, kind, insecure, a blabbering idiot at times, but one thing he was not: a coward. "All right," he said softly. Katsuki slowly crept forward on the mattress, their faces only a few inches apart. He could feel Katsuki's hot breath on his cheeks, inhale the scent of burnt caramel and fire, hear the mattress creaking under their weight and see nothing but those obtrusive red eyes. Then he felt it, like sparks flying or the way rings of water disturbed the surface after a single touch. Katsuki's lips were gentle and soft. A weird sense of excitement and belonging washed over him, like he hadn't been complete before this. Their pinkies were still thoroughly locked as Katsuki slowly pulled back. Izuku was staring mesmerized at him, missing the touch of his lips already. I don't think it worked. Do it again?" Izuku said, didn't even notice his order before Katsuki slid into a satisfied smile. Then he leaned closer again and stopped just before. "Open your mouth just a little bit," he said softly, his free hand caressing Izuku's face. Izuku did as he was told immediately, and once again felt those soft lips on his own. Then surprisingly, Katsuki worked inside his tongue, and playfully liked the roof of his mouth, before caressing Izuku's own tongue. The sensation sent shivers down his spine, and he leaned in eagerly for more. He tried mimicking Katsuki's movements, well aware that it was sloppy and new to him, but he couldn't stop himself. A desire took root inside of him as he released their pinkies to clasp both his hands around Katsuki's face and drag him as close as possible, eager to prolong the experience, and Katsuki happily obliged. Katsuki rolled around, dragging Izuku with him, until Izuku was half sitting, half laying on top of Katsuki. Izuku didn't notice, nor did he care about the suggestive position. All he knew was it allowed him better entry into Katsuki's tasteful mouth. Their faces angled to deepen the kiss, and Izuku felt driven by some unknown animalistic desire inside of him. He let out soft mms into the other's mouth, gripped his hair tightly to secure himself, and leaned into Katsuki's exploring touches that ran up and down his side and back. Once he was sure he would faint if he did not break up the kiss, Izuku forced himself to draw back a little. He didn't move though. He couldn't force himself into moving. Instead, he drew heavy breaths as he stared intensely at the other. "Kiss me harder," Katsuki demanded after he'd caught his breath. Izuku felt helplessly daring and crushed their lips together, his tongue liking the soft lips before he forced himself in. Katsuki's hands on his hips drove him crazy. He wasn't gentle anymore. Neither of them were. He bit hard onto Katsuki's lower lip, earning a love-crazed as he liked away the blood and felt it sting on his tongue. He pressed down harder, using his body to pin the other into the mattress. "Hell, you're so perfect," Katsuki ummed as Izuku bit into his earlobe teasingly before sking it. He had no idea what he was doing, but he couldn't stop. He wanted more. He was greedy and afraid it would all go away if he stopped, so he didn't give Katsuki the opportunity to stop. He was yearning for the feelings the other invoked inside of him, desperate for it. He clawed, kissed and bit him as if marking him for ownership, and Katsuki loved every second of it. He loved the way Izuku marked him like an animal, loved how unfiltered and raw Izuku was when he was immersed in their touches. A sudden knock on the door made Izuku freeze, though Katsuki seemed unbothered, and continued kissing Izuku's neck as he raised it to look towards the door. "Izuku? Is everything all right in there?" Toshinori's voice asked. Izuku looked bewildered back at the love-struck man underneath him, who looked like he had no intention of stopping. "Why yes why?" he asked, stopping himself from emitting a yelp of surprise as Katsuki's hands slip underneath his loosened shirt and up his stomach. "You should go to bed, son. I see your light is still on." "Of course. I just forgot about the time, you know me," Izuku said in a bit of a high-pitched voice as he slammed his hand over Katsuki's mouth to stop him from leaving heated kisses everywhere. "All right, well, good night, son." "Good night," Izuku called back and listened intently until the echoing sound of steps disappeared. He shot Katsuki with a disapproving look. "You maniac," he hissed. Katsuki liked Izuku's fingers with a lewd look that made him squeal in surprise and fall back. Katsuki grinned wildly satisfied at him. "You need to go now," Izuku whispered. "What why? What do you mean why? That was my father." "So?" Katsuki asked, propping himself onto his elbows and looking hungrily at Izuku, who had landed somewhere on the floor in his embarrassment. Izuku blushed and had to look away before he jumped back on top of the hunk of meat on his bed, sprawled out so deliciously in front of him. Gods, his mind was going wild with lewd images. He seriously needed to cleanse his thoughts soon. "I'm serious, Katsuki, you need to leave." "I don't want to," he retorted childishly. "Well, we can't do this anymore, I need to sleep." "So, we can sleep together?" Izuku gawked speechlessly at him, but obviously Katsuki wasn't kidding around. He shook his head to collect his thoughts and got up from the floor. He yanked Katsuki off the bed, dragging him by the collar as the other chuckled in amusement. He checked the hallway was free before pushing the other ruthlessly out. "Oh come on, I'll behave," Katsuki pleaded. "No, I will see you tomorrow, good night," Izuku said determinedly before slamming the door in his face. He didn't hear Katsuki walk away, but he had a tendency to move silently like a cat sometimes, so Izuku didn't ponder too deeply about it. Instead he took a second to calm his flustered heart and looked guiltily back at his now severely disheveled bed. He changed quickly, noticing with annoyance how hard he was as he glanced down. He blew out his light before climbing back into his bed. Now that there was silence all around him, his mind helplessly replayed the wild make-out session from earlier. He closed his eyes, letting the lingering scent of Katsuki fill his nose as he brushed his fingers against his hard length. His body twitched from the gentle touch, and he sighed in surrender as he fully gave in to his desire. His mind and body eagerly remembered every touch and every kiss. He imagined Katsuki's beautiful body caging him in, whispering in his ear as he arched his back and squeezed around his member. He let out a soft biting his swollen lips to stop himself from being too loud as he relentlessly picked up the speed and imagined Katsuki's elegant soft hands curl around his pee-pee, egging him on. He saw those hungry and intense red eyes in his mind as he whimpered for release and his body responded. The thrill of the release sent shivers down his spine and made every hair on his body stand up. Once he calmed down, he opened his eyes frantically, searching the room. He could have sworn he felt like he was being watched, but nobody was around. Maybe it was the lingering effect Katsuki's eyes had on him. He always looked at him like he was the greatest thing on earth, like there was no one else around, just the two of them. Such an intense feeling was not easy to shake off. Yes, that had to be it. He cleaned himself off before curling into the bed sheets and let out a sigh of contentment. His mind and body were spent, but happy, and he welcomed sleep with eagerness. Apparently, his mind was not as willing to let him rest as he'd hoped. He dreamt of a wretched nightmare where he was endlessly drowning. He tried clawing his way to the top, but he couldn't. He just kept on sinking into the endless pit of darkness. When he awoke with a sudden gasp, Izuku tried controlling his breathing. He looked around to calm himself but instead shrieked with surprise as he saw a very big cat sitting outside on the window ledge, leaning against the glass, looking intently at him. Izuku blinked in surprise, making sure he'd seen correctly. The cat seemed oddly familiar, yet he was sure he'd never seen so big a cat before. However, there was something about those eyes, something scary, something recognizable. He had never seen a cat with red eyes before and it made him uneasy. When he rubbed his eyes to get a clearer view of it, it had disappeared, as if it was nothing but a lingering dream. Something was different. Izuku could tell from the moment he woke up the next morning. His senses seemed keener than usual. He noticed it during breakfast too and ate a much larger portion than he usually would, simply because his taste buds were exploding with flavors. "What an appetite you've got this morning, young master," Mr. Aizawa pointed out as him and his father were the only ones awake to enjoy the morning. "It is a good thing. You need the protein if we are to go on our hunting trip today." Tashinori exclaimed excitedly. "Will you be joining us today, Mr. Aizawa?" Izuku asked, liking his lips to extract the leftover sugar from the marmalade he'd just consumed. "I must admit I am not much of a hunter, but I should like to accompany you anyway to see you in action if that is all right?" he asked politely. Izuku simply hummed in joy. "Sounds wonderful. You seem to be in a great mood today, son. I was worried you didn't get much sleep last night, but I see that is not the case." "Oh?" Mr. Aizawa asked pointedly and glanced curiously at Izuku. Izuku blushed as he remembered last night's events and stuffed his mouth so he had time to navigate his thoughts. "Well, I was too excited, so I ended up staying up late to sketch and draw." Technically that wasn't a lie, but Mr. Aizawa did not seem convinced, however he didn't pry, which Izuku was grateful for. "I will let you finish your breakfast as I call on Mr. Yamada to gather the dogs and equipment needed for our excursion," Tashinori stated and was about to leave his seat. "Oh, that won't be necessary," Izuku remarked with a wide grin. "We do not need the dogs, it is more fun the old-fashioned way." "Oh right, Mr. Torino taught you how to use bow and arrow, correct?" Tashinori asked curiously. "Right. Maybe I should teach you to use a hunting rifle, so you could use both?" Tashinori innocently suggested. Izuku lit into a bright smile. "Really? That sounds fun, all right," he admitted, Though he was aware he would probably still prefer the feeling of a bow in his hands in comparison to a rifle, however this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of father-son bonding. Certainly, Izuku would not turn that down. In the end, they settled on bringing a variety of firearms and a big lunch to their trip. Izuku was excited, and he couldn't help but to happily hum as he went to unsheath his hidden bow and quiver of arrows. Despite it having been used for years, it did not look old or worn. Mr. Torino had thoroughly taught Izuku how to properly care for his weapon, which he was grateful for. Back when he and Mr. Torino had parted ways, he'd gifted Izuku his own bow and arrows alongside a kit to maintain it. He had cherished it deeply. Back then the bow had been a bit too big for Izuku, but Mr. Torino had correctly guessed that he would grow into it with time, so now it fit Izuku like a glove. The arrows were more difficult since he occasionally had to get new ones. Sometimes he would, in the cover of night, sneak into the nearby city to procure a fresh set, but he had more times than he could count, reused arrows several times before giving up on them. His current set of arrows weren't too bad. He had a variety of different kinds, mostly to challenge himself and train. Some were with flat ends, used for causing a distraction or forcing his prey into movement, by firing it into a tree to cause noise. Others were long and thin with a sharp arrowhead. Those were better for long range, or if he was hunting birds. However, he'd only been able to use them properly on birds the last couple of years or so when his aim got better. If it hit too much off course it would damage the meat. Though on smaller prey it was normal to use blunt arrows, which essentially hurt or concussed the prey, but left the meat undamaged. His most commonly used ones were quite ordinary. They were of an average length, about 25 inches, not too short and not too long. They contained a broadhead arrowhead, since that was common for hunting, and a somewhat weighted fletching to even out the weight distribution from the bigger arrowhead. Sometimes Izuku would buy arrows and customize them to his needs. Most people around preferred using hunting rifles nowadays, so the selection of arrows wasn't as wide as he would like. Perhaps that was for the better. That gave him the excuse to experiment with constructing his own personalized arrows. "How grown up you look!" Toshinori exclaimed as Izuku joined them with his gear in his arms. Izuku grinned widely at them. He was excited, perhaps even more so, to prove to his father just how self-sufficient he could be, now that Toshinori had promised to loosen up the reins on his rules. They didn't bring any sort of servants along with them, mostly due to Izuku insisting it would be more fun with just the three of them, and since lunch already had been packed there was no need to drag away the servants from the house. The forest Toshinori had mentioned was called Moosewald, and it was infamous for its array of wild animals. The forest certainly lived up to its name. It was literally a forest, covered in moss. The wild assortment of color and type of moss made it feel like some kind of fantasy land, and Izuku had already jumped off the carriage in pursuit of cataloging the different kinds of moss in the forest. It seemed almost ethereal, the way the sun shone against the different moss. Some he recognized, some he didn't. Austria timia moss as well as common haircap moss were recognizable, others almost started shining from the sunlight, and Izuku was in awe of the sight. Mr. Aizawa chuckled at his reaction. "Looks like we are not alone," Toshinori said and nodded politely towards a couple of servants further out that were caring for a group of horses, probably from another larger company. "Bummer," Izuku noted, annoyed. With another group in the same area, it could cause distractions and scare off animals. They collected their things and left the coachman in charge of the carriage and horses before setting off. Izuku was too amazed at his surroundings to pay much attention to the others. His senses were overflowing from the surrounding forest. He felt goosebumps all over as the many impressions bombarded him. It was amazing. He felt the soft touch of the wind, grazing his cheeks. The green colors erupting in different shades and shapes, with the occasional appearance of some colorful flowers. The leaves rustling and the crunching of his footsteps left echoes in his ears, but the star of the show were the blackbirds releasing their enchanting singing through the widespread forest. Izuku had to stop for a moment to ground himself from the angelic and surreal feeling that had overtaken his body. He had no idea what could have caused a sudden change inside of him. He had often, if not always, held the beauty of nature in high regard, but he had never felt it as deeply inside his soul as now. Izuku, my dear boy, are you all right? Toshinori asked as he adjusted the rifle on his shoulder. It's just breathtaking. Izuku sighed contently. They walked for what seemed like hours. They spotted a few rabbits and squirrels, but nothing spectacular. They hadn't decided to hunt for something particular, but it was exciting anyway. Just going in blind and see what you might find. How about you get some training with a rifle? I see a pheasant not too far away. Toshinori whispered and slowly handed the rifle over to Izuku. Toshinori took the training very literally and adjusted and guided him like there was no tomorrow. By the time Izuku had taken a proper stance and everything was in order, the pheasant was out of sight. That's all right, dear boy. Maybe start and see if you can hit a certain tree or something, just for practice. Toshinori suggested and happily watched his son. The weapon felt heavy in Izuku's hands. He felt a bit uneasy using it. It was so different from his usual choice of weapon, but he wanted to try for his father's sake. Heaven knows if there was one thing Toshinori could get excited about, it was weapons of all kinds. He loved it whenever the military issued new kinds and always signed himself up as the first to try them out. It had been a while since Toshinori actually had been in the field, but he'd been renowned worldwide for his skill. It was the reason they'd traveled so much. Not only was he a high-ranking general, but he was also often independently hired for consultations, training of soldiers or other political stuff across Europe. Izuku set his sights on a certain tree, using its broken-off branch as target practice. He followed Toshinori's guiding and fired. Setting off the weapon caused a push in his arms he was unfamiliar with, and he felt sore. He had forgotten Toshinori's advice on how to hold it tight and brace for impact, so it rammed harshly into his shoulder and missed the target completely, landing only God knows where. Izuku grunted in displeasure, nearly dropping the weapon. Toshinori shrieked and hurried to his side. What happened? Are you hurt? I think my shoulder popped. Izuku mumbled thinkingly. It did not hurt as much as he'd expected, but his arm was hanging limply from his dislodged shoulder. Oh, great heavens! Toshinori burst out frantically. Oh, this is all my fault. He continued, riddled with guilt. How are you not screaming right now? Mr. Aizawa asked, shocked as he took in the deformity of his shoulder. No idea, shock maybe? I don't know, it doesn't hurt as much as I'd expected. Izuku contemplated. No, something was definitely up with his body. First his senses had been turned up to a max, and now he only felt 1/10 of the pain he was supposed to be feeling? Something was off, but he had no idea what. I need to reset it. Toshinori exclaimed, finally having regained some sense. Maybe it's better to get him to a physician? Mr. Aizawa suggested nervously. I don't think it's necessary. Izuku admitted. Just put it back in place, you've done that before, right? Izuku looked at his father. Right. Well, I've reset a nose and a couple of fingers, not an entire shoulder before. Toshinori admitted hesitantly. Just do it. Izuku said, making up his mind for the both of them. Toshinori gently pried off his tailcoat, trying not to move Izuku's shoulder too much. Then he loosened the fabric of the cotton shirt to pull it half off him, to expose the skin. He inspected it thoroughly before he gently put his hand on his back, the other on the shoulder. In a quick movement, a loud snap echoed through the quiet forest. Toshinori nervously stepped away, waiting for Izuku to show some sign of pain as he tried moving it around. It had hurt for a short while, but now he only felt a slight ache in his shoulder as he moved it around. Strange, she thought. Good Lord, are you all right? Mr. Aizawa asked nervously as he inspected the entire shoulder blade and arm. I think I'm fine, although I'm not sure how. Izuku admitted before sliding into a grin. That's perfect, then we don't have to go back yet. Toshinori and Mr. Aizawa exchanged worried glances. I think we should, just in case. Not at all. Izuku insisted, spinning his arm around perfectly. See, no troubles. He hastily pulled his arm back through his sleeve, but didn't retie his neckcloth or put on his tailcoat. Instead he stuffed it into his bag and set off at a brisk pace, leaving the others yelling behind him before they caught up. Tell us the second it hurts. Izuku, this is no joke. Mr. Aizawa pleaded. I promise. Izuku said and shot him a wide grin. But despite their expectations, he wasn't trying to appear strong or hide his pain. He really wasn't lying when he said he barely felt it. Maybe it was the adrenaline pumping through his body that suppressed the pain, or maybe something else entirely, but for now he was grateful they didn't have to turn back. But look! Izuku exclaimed in a hushed whisper as a magnificent red deer peeked its head slightly over a bush further ahead. They all stopped in their tracks and observed it. "Wait here," Izuku whispered as he silently hoisted himself into a nearby tree, climbing with a certain agility the others hadn't seen from him before. He was too focused on his prey to notice though. The ground level didn't offer a clean shot, so he hoped that moving a level up might do the trick. Just as he had suspected, Izuku watched with intensity as the stag was drinking from a nearby brook. It was far away, maybe about 50 yards, give or take. With a busted shoulder and the awkward position, Izuku wouldn't normally take the shot and expect to hit it perfectly, but a surge of confidence blasted through him, heating his entire body. Izuku slowly wrapped his legs securely around the branch, fastening himself as he positioned his bow. He would have to turn it slightly to the side, since he was sitting down when taking the shot. He pulled one of the broadhead arrows and placed the nock perfectly with the string. Not once had he removed his eyes from the target as he quietly and perfectly prepared. He took a deep breath as he straightened out his posture and pulled back firmly. His shoulder only let out a quiet ache, but nothing worth noting. The stag straightened up, listening to its surroundings, feeling the lurking predator in the area. Izuku aimed with practiced ease. He could almost see the stag move before it did. Then he released his tight hold along with his breath, and the arrow flew with precision and fierce determination through the air. The stag noticed it, but too late, it bucked to the left as Izuku had expected, jumping right into its own death. The arrow clashed perfectly and tore through the skin of the stag's side. It let out a painful sound that confirmed he had hit it in its heart, before it wobbled around trying to move on. It managed to go no more than 20 yards before collapsing. Izuku was grinning victoriously as he jumped back onto the ground. He had been more than 3 yards into the air, but somehow, he didn't feel the aftershock of landing on the ground. Instead, he leapt straight into a run towards his target, with both men chasing wildly behind him, still in awe at what they'd just seen. Once he found the blood trail, the stag came into view. It took its last breath just seconds before Izuku was at its side. He offered a quiet thank you and blessing to the soul of the animal he'd just killed, before turning back to his company that had been quietly observing him. Much better with a bow than a gun, right? Izuku teased with a boyish grin that made the other two chuckle. "That was amazing, my boy," Toshinori admitted. Izuku bathed in the attention while blushing wildly. "How on earth are we supposed to carry that back? It is huge." Mr. Aizawa burst out frustrated. "I've got it," Izuku said confidently. The two just stared stupidly at him before bursting into laughter. "As strong as you might be, I think such a huge stag might be too much even for you," Mr. Aizawa concluded. Izuku scowled at him. "Why don't we eat lunch and figure out how to transport the thing before we start heading back?" Toshinori suggested, sitting down on a nearby tilted tree that had been overgrown with even more moss. The three of them ate mostly in silence. The occasional remark about Izuku's wonderful abilities came into light and made him blush yet still yearn for their approval. Izuku finished quicker than the other two as they'd begun a conversation on some political problem Izuku wasn't interested in. He took in the state of his prey before rummaging through his bag. He pulled out a trusty woven cloth and started securing it around the stag with rope. Once he had properly mummified it, he gave it a gentle pull, just to get a feel of the weight. He was surprised to find himself stronger than he expected. Maybe it was the aftereffects of his previous adrenaline rush, but he felt strong and emboldened, and not one bit worried about his recent injury. In a sudden movement he swung the red deer over his shoulders, staggering slightly under the weight before getting used to it. "Are you insane?" Mr. Aizawa yelped, half choking on his lunch. Toshinori sprung to his legs, gawking speechlessly. "Let's go before I decide it becomes too heavy," Izuku said with a wide grin, beginning the walk back to the edge of the forest. The other two hastened to gather their stuff before frantically rushing after him. They kept on glaring suspiciously at him, asking him if he wanted help, but Izuku didn't mind the feeling of using his body. Sure, the animal smelled, and he was sweating buckets in the heat, and yes, some of the blood had seeped through the cloth and soaked his entire neck and chest, making him look much like a wild caveman, yet he'd never felt better. There was an extra spring in his step, a feeling of fulfillment and joy that left him with nothing but more energy to use. So he did. He pushed beyond his limits, and he loved every second of it. By the time they came to the edge of the forest, Izuku was breathing ruggedly, his entire body shaking and aching, but he was grinning like a sadistic maniac. Izuku finally let go of it, and let it sink to the ground in a deep thud. "You're positively insane," Mr. Aizawa grumbled. None of them were impressed anymore. Instead, they were more accurately terrified. Izuku started shaking his legs, jumping around to loosen up his body, but he stilled as he realized the hunting party that had kept their horses close to Toshinori's carriage all had returned and was staring shocked at their party. Izuku even noticed how some of them hid away a few rabbits at the sight of the huge beast Izuku had managed to take down. He smiled mischievously at the sight, reveling in the feeling of superiority. It was unlike him, but he didn't mind, in fact he loved it. It was rare, if ever, that he had the opportunity to gloat like this. He couldn't wait to get back and push it into his friends' faces. Toshinori smacked Izuku at the back of his neck playfully. "Get off your high horse and help us, kid." Izuku chuckled as he helped them load the stag onto the back of the carriage. The coachman was looking ghastly as he tried to mount it to the carriage with ropes and whatever else he could find to keep it secure for the journey back home. Eventually they managed to secure it in a joint effort. However, the stag's antlers stuck out through the side, and a hoof, maybe two, hung over the edge, dangling as the carriage moved. Still, they managed to get it back in one piece. When the carriage finally entered back onto the estate grounds, Toshinori started wildly barking orders left and right, causing the servants to run around in a panicked state. Mr. Aizawa slumped into a chair near Mr. Yamada that had come out to see the ruckus. It was already late afternoon as Izuku watched the servants struggle to lift the stag onto a large makeshift table they'd put together alongside a variety of bowls, knives, and other tools to cut up the animal. Izuku's eyes darted to meet those of Katsuki's as soon as he felt them prickle his neck. He grinned and waved at him as Katsuki moved from the door with an elegant parasol over his head. My. Katsuki commented as he observed the spectacle. Kirishima and Shiro joined them as well, looking impressed at the glorious animal. "What an animal, who caught it?" Kirishima asked approvingly. "Who else, my son, of course." Toshinori laughed loudly, placing a proud hand on Izuku's shoulder. "I couldn't believe it, it was something out of a fairy tale, I'll tell you that much." "You caught it?" Katsuki asked, stunned, looking curiously at Izuku. "He carried it back too. I can't believe how he managed to do it. The thing must weigh between 400 to 500 pounds. Toshinori boasted. Kirishima, Shiro, and Katsuki stared wildly at him. Right after he dislocated his shoulder too. Toshinori pondered. "Which reminds me, I'll call the physician to check if it's all right," Toshinori said before scurrying off, barking orders. "Did you?" Kirishima asked Katsuki carefully, glancing between the two of them. "Absolutely not." Katsuki confirmed, looking bewildered. "Then how?" Shiro added, confused. "What are you talking about?" Izuku asked, trying to make out what they were discussing without words. The three of them turned to stare at him in equal confusion, before Katsuki ran his fingertips alongside his lips and suddenly looked like he remembered something. He looked stunned at the others. "Only a drop or so," he then said. "But that shouldn't be nearly enough. You could give him a gallon and that still wouldn't explain this. Not even a fully transitioned erg can do that." Shiro whispered, incited. "Guys, I'm right here, you don't have to ignore me," Izuku remarked sassily, while crossing his arms disapprovingly. "Alright, sorry, we're just shocked is all," Kirishima said apologetically, plastering on a polite smile. Izuku glanced between the three of them in suspicion. "It just proves out what I already know," Katsuki said, sneaking his hand over Izuku's hip, pulling him closer. "What is that?" Izuku asked nervously from the sudden intimacy. That you're remarkable in every sense of the word," Katsuki said, holding eye contact intensely. Izuku squealed in surprise and shoved him off embarrassed. "You don't say such things so casually," he insisted awkwardly. The other two laughed affectionately as Katsuki started pouting from the rejection of his compliment. "Besides, I'm covered in blood, sweat and dirt. Now is not exactly the time if I think you look enchanting," Katsuki interrupting with a certain possessive wilderness in his voice that made Izuku uncertain and hot all over. "Hell, you're insufferable." Shiro chuckled. "If it hadn't been because Bakugu so proudly showcased those love marks, I would never have believed you to be such an animal." Izuku, Kirishima teased, making Izuku short-circuit in his brain, before turning tomato red all over from the comment. "Why you showed them? God, you're awful." Izuku burst out hysterically like a child throwing a tantrum, because he didn't know what else to do. Katsuki simply stared dumbly at him. "Of course, I'm glad you returned my sentiments, obviously I wanted to showcase it," he said in a dead serious tone that caught Izuku off. The freckled man violently shoved him away with a shriek of embarrassment before fleeing the scene frustrated beyond his wits. He heard the echoing laughter screeching in his head but made every effort to shut it out so he could focus on his own emotional turmoil. Izuku was startled awake by a nightmare. His breathing was frantic and he was sweating from the duress, still not really sure if he was awake. He glanced around his room, but his eyes caught a lean figure in the corner by the window. He stared speechlessly at the dark presence, until lightning struck nearby. The short flicker of light illuminated the figure and revealed none other than Katsuki, drenched in blood with a fierce and otherworldly look to him. "Katsuki?" he asked nervously, but as he blinked, the figure was gone, not a trace of him left. Almost as if he had never been there to begin with? Izuku had been too starstruck and scared to properly react, but now his mind was going into overdrive, trying to piece things together. He was certain it had been Katsuki, but what if he was still dreaming? What if it was a lingering image from his nightmare? And the way he had looked, covered in blood looking like a wild animal, it was unlike anything Izuku had ever seen before. He couldn't go back to sleep as both his thoughts and heart were racing uncontrollably. He had to check for himself, see if Katsuki was okay. No person would be okay if they'd lost so much blood. Izuku draped his dark green dressing down over his nightshirt, jumped into a pair of slippers and snuck out of his room. He just had to check. His heart was going frantic at the thought of losing Katsuki. He knew it was probably a nightmare, but it seemed like an unsettling omen to Izuku, and he would rather check than lay anxious until sunup. Izuku crept quietly down the west wing and stopped nervously outside of Katsuki's door. He wasn't sure what to do or say, but he had to check if he was okay. So, he knocked quietly. "Hey Katsuki, are you in there?" he whispered. He heard no sound or movement, so he gently tried the door handle. It was locked. Izuku was already starting to get more scared. He knocked again more desperately this time, louder too. "Katsuki, are you all right?" he asked into the silence of the night. Izuku kept on knocking as dark thoughts seemed to cloud his mind and send him into a spiral of fear. He tore frantically at the doorknob, almost on the verge of crying. He didn't care if he woke up anyone else, he just had to see with his own eyes that Katsuki was safe and sound. "Katsuki!" Izuku pleaded as he hammered his fist against the door. Then suddenly he heard the lock, and the door was pried open. Katsuki was there, half naked, rubbing out some sleep in his eyes. "Izuku?" he asked and yawned. Izuku didn't even think, simply attacked the man in a desperate hug. "Hey, what's going on?" Katsuki asked quietly as he hesitantly hugged him back. Izuku could barely contain his tears anymore. I just had to check, I had a terrible nightmare. I had to see if you're okay. I'm so sorry for waking you, so sorry." Izuku sobbed, squeezing him harder. "Come on in," Katsuki said in a calm voice, closing the door behind him while he maneuvered Izuku towards his bed. "I'm tired, lay down with me," Katsuki insisted and dramatically yawned again. Izuku was biting his lip hard in embarrassment, but he knew he couldn't let go just yet, so he complied with the order and lay down in his bed, hugging him tightly. He was pressing his face into Katsuki's bare chest, desperate to hear his slow and calm heartbeat. "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere," Katsuki whispered, stroking the green hair with an affectionate manner. "Don't leave me, don't you dare," Izuku whispered against his chest, pulling him tighter. "I would never," Katsuki said with a knowing smirk plastered to his face, one Izuku didn't notice since he was too preoccupied with meshing his face with the other's chest. It took a while, but the slow heartbeat in his ears eventually calmed Izuku down, and he fell asleep in Katsuki's arms. "Izuku, my boy. Good to see you up and about this morning," Toshinori exclaimed at their casual breakfast. Izuku had snuck out of Katsuki's room where the other was sleeping like the dead and then went directly to breakfast with his father and teacher. "How come you're in such a good mood today?" Izuku inquired. "I was simply looking forward to our afternoon sparring session later," Toshinori hummed. Izuku and his father had grown a lot closer since the hunt. They had begun sparring daily, to teach Izuku self-defense. It seemed that Izuku's eagerness to learn and stubbornness made for a great student, and Toshinori was brimming with excitement at having back some feeling of familiarity with teaching others as he'd sometimes done in the military. So, all in all, they were a good match for that sort of father-son bonding. Toshinori grew prouder each day, excited to boast about his son's evolvement to everyone that would listen. Mostly Mr. Aizawa. He was so sick of hearing the constant praise he'd begun avoiding them whenever possible just to escape listening to the long list of achievements from Izuku's side. Izuku, on the other hand, was starting to wonder if his father was beginning to feel a little restrained at the manor, and perhaps he was eager for company outside of the familiar faces he saw every day. "Actually, I was thinking if it wouldn't soon be time for you to visit some friends, father?" Izuku suggested innocently. "Not right now, of course. But since you're giving me more space to roam freely within, perhaps it is time you do the same? I know you have been declining invites to parties and get-togethers since we settled here, and wondered if it might soon be time for you to open up to the world again. Sounds like you're growing tired of your father's company," Mr. Aizawa joked, earning a scandalized stare from Izuku. "Not at all. I rather enjoy our time together." It was a simple suggestion to be taken under advisement. "I am now old enough to entertain myself and my guests here without constant supervision." "So, you want to be alone with your friends?" Toshinori asked thinkingly. Mr. Aizawa sent Izuku a gloating stare. "It wouldn't happen to be one particular individual you would like to share some alone time with, would it?" He teased. "You're awfully snappy this morning. Did Mr. Yamada not kiss you goodbye this morning, or what?" Izuku bit back sassily, watching Mr. Aizawa's face pale. "Goodness me, Izuku!" Toshinori exclaimed before starting a light-hearted chuckle that soon drew all of them in. "Well, I won't make any promises, but I'll take it into consideration." Toshinori smiled. Izuku eagerly returned the smile. Recently, his stepfather seemed to have regained some of his former joy, but he did not wish to limit his joy only to Izuku. Selfishly, he perhaps wished his father would regain his place in society in some ways, mostly because it would make sure if Izuku ever were to leave, that his father at least wouldn't be cut off from the rest of the world anymore. By the time Izuku had finished his classes and sparring session for the day, he washed himself before changing and set out to find his friends. He found the group all huddled up on top of picnic blankets and pillows in the shade of a large tree. They all turned their heads as soon as they noticed him joining them. Mina had been snacking on a few strawberries, and they'd all enjoyed a fresh glass of lemonade. "How was your day?" Mina asked kindly as she sat up, offering to join her blanket, and he eagerly did so. He was not shy and jumped into the assortment of snacks that had been brought out by the servants. "It was good. Nothing special so far," Izuku remarked. "How about you all?" Same old, same old." Mina shrugged. "Kirishima was just telling us about the time he was locked inside a bathhouse." Denki chuckled. "Oh no. What happened?" Izuku asked intrigued. Kirishima grinned wildly at him, exposing a few sharp teeth that had been hiding. "I had snuck in and gone to the bathroom while they were closing up. By the time I got back, the entire place had been locked off for the night. I didn't think they would drain out all the water of the baths, so I was left there until they opened back up the morning after. They found me cuddled up against the door, trying to get warm since it had been freezing that night. I got a proper beating from that, so I haven't gone back to one ever since. He burst out with laughter, and the group joined in. Even Katsuki offered a smirk, which was as good as roaring laughter. Oh no! Izuku said, trying to contain his giggles as he imagined Kirishima helplessly stuck in a cold bathhouse all night. It was a pitiful picture, and hard not to laugh at. What about you, Izuku? Any funny stories? Denki asked, winking suggestively at him. I don't think they're in the same category as yours. Izuku chuckled innocently. Although I did one time light one of our servants on fire by accident. What? You have to tell me how that went down. Mina burst out. I was bored and had been playing around with a notebook too close to a candlelight. Next thing I knew, my notebook was on fire and a passing servant saw. He rushed over to help me, but I insisted on stomping on it myself until it went out. I accidentally knocked him into the bookcase while jumping around. His sleeve caught on the candlelight, and he ran out of the room screaming with his shirt on fire until he found somewhere to put it out. That's insane. Shiro laughed loudly, and the others joined. Luckily he wasn't hurt, but I was banned from being around lit candles alone the next month though. Izuku pouted. Then he was torn from his own thoughts of the memory by the sudden hoarse laughter that erupted from Katsuki's throat. Izuku stiffened and stared at him. He didn't think he'd ever seen Katsuki fully laugh before, not like this anyway. It was a sight to behold. He looked beautiful with a side smile and wrinkles around his eyes as he had forced them shut. Hell, I don't think I've ever seen Bakugo laugh before. Mina murmured, amazed. Katsuki's red eyes caught Izuku's as his laughter stilled. You're such a dork. He mumbled affectionately, making Izuku's face catch on fire. Somehow, the insult felt like a term of endearment as opposed to a taunting noun. I am not. Izuku resisted. Katsuki, who had gradually inched himself across the blankets, was now close enough to reach his arm out and ruffle the green hair teasingly. Izuku slapped his hand away, embarrassed. Katsuki kept reaching out and Izuku swatted him away until they ended in a half-hearted tussle, making the rest of the group chuckle. Finally, Katsuki dropped in surrender, his head in Izuku's lap with his hands held up innocently. Izuku scoffed disapprovingly, but didn't push the blonde off his lap. I am so glad we met you, Mina said as she smiled warmly at him. Likewise. Izuku hummed satisfied. I'm so happy to be friend with all of you, he exclaimed excitedly. Katsuki wriggled in his lap, catching his attention. His brows were scrunched up almost angrily. What? Izuku asked, confused. Take that back, I am not your friend. What? Izuku asked, suddenly horrified. Katsuki raised himself to sit in eyesight before crossing his arms. We have never been friends and never will be, he stated sourly. Izuku thought he felt his heart creak painfully over the statement that left little up for discussion. Maybe we should go? Denki asked quietly, gradually nudging his friends further away to offer privacy. Izuku hardly noticed it, as he was only staring at Katsuki. What do you mean we aren't friends? Izuku asked. What I said, you dork. Katsuki persisted. Izuku felt like crying, but he tried not to let it show and bottled up his emotions after best ability. If we are not friends, what are we then? You think I would court you so intensely to simply be your friend? Katsuki asked, dumbstruck. Izuku was too confused to answer or even think. Katsuki rolled his eyes before continuing. Obviously I had no intention of ever being your friend. I want more, I want you to be mine. What does that even mean? Izuku asked, thoroughly confused. You think friends look at you the way I do? You think friends kiss each other like we do? You think friends love each other like we do? If so, I don't want you to have any friends besides me. What are you saying? I'm saying Katsuki reached out and put his hands on either side of Izuku's face. I am yours as you are mine, in a sense far beyond that of the empty word, friends. We are meant to be, and you promise to stay with me forever. Izuku's train of thought crashed violently. I thought my intentions were obvious from the beginning. Katsuki said sternly. I never intended for us to be friends, I want more. Izuku in his breath sharply and stared helplessly in his eyes but found only that he spoke the truth. Katsuki wanted him, in a deeper sense of the word. So, you love me? Izuku asked uncertainly. I love you in a way I did not think. Possible. Izuku, do you not feel the same? If Izuku had learnt anything from his reaction to thinking he'd lost Katsuki earlier this morning, it was that he in fact loved Katsuki very much. However, the words felt stuck in his throat. Do not fret, I have no intention of ever letting you go. I have waited this long for your affections. I don't mind waiting longer. Katsuki said softly, planting a tender kiss on his forehead. Katsuki slowly let him go, before getting up and wandering off. Izuku was left in a stupor, sitting frozen in place as his heart galloped away with him. He stared blankly into the air, not noticing anything going on around him. He was too deep in his own thoughts. He did love Katsuki, but it was too soon, too hasty. He was not ready yet. He was not ready to admit it to the world, let alone himself, just yet. He was even more grateful that Katsuki had left him to his thoughts, knowing that an overthinker like Izuku would need time to process and deal properly with his thoughts and emotions before giving a proper response. Are you all right, kid? Mr. Yamada asked, concerned, dragging Izuku from his spiraling thoughts. Huh? Mr. Yamada laughed at him, and he finally noticed he'd been sitting alone, consumed in thought for a while now. If you need something to do to get your mind off things, I'm just on my way to pluck apples. Would you care to join? Yes, thank you. Izuku concluded and got up from his spot before following Mr. Yamada. Looks like you got a lot on your mind, something you want to talk about, or would you rather we didn't? The groundskeeper asked neutrally. Not right now. Izuku sighed defeatedly. No trouble, I'll just tell you about those pestering crows that have been plaguing us recently. I'll tell you, kid, I've never seen anything like it. Mr. Yamada proceeded to go on a deep-rooted rant about the sudden flock of crows that had taken residence nearby and savagely ransacked both the vegetable and fruit gardens alongside his pockets. He mentioned one of them recently had flown off with one of his coins, along with every other scrap metal that shone in the sunlight. The light-hearted complaint managed to blow life back into Izuku, and he happily joined in. So, he spent the afternoon picking apples and laughing with Mr. Yamada. During dinner he listened in on the many joyful conversations, most of them from their guests. However, his head constantly turned in Katsuki's direction by default. The blonde was acting as if nothing had changed and still sought out his company after dinner. They were sitting in the alcove in the red parlor, both reading silently, not saying much. He did notice Katsuki did not reach out and grab his hand or cuddle him, as he usually did, but it was probably him showing restraint until Izuku was ready, which he thought was adorable. He couldn't help but miss those affectionate touches though. Izuku had loved them, now it was mostly just the occasional fleeting touch. He hadn't noticed how accustomed to the affection he'd become until Katsuki started holding back. It went on like that for 2 weeks until Izuku finally snapped. Arg! Tashinori yelped, surprised, as his son had just swung him over his shoulder and crushed him to the ground. Good Lord, what has gotten into you today? Tashinori exclaimed, shocked as he caught his breath on the ground. Their sparring session today had seemed rougher than usual, especially from Izuku's side, who was showing unusually aggressive behavior. Sorry. Izuku grumbled, rubbing his eyes annoyed. I am quite worked up, it seems. I'll say, great heavens, son, that is some strength you got. Izuku reached his hand out to help his stepfather back up. Let's take a break, Tashinori said, stretching his aching body as he huddled towards the 2 garden chairs where fresh glasses of juices had been prepared for them. So, I took your advice. You're right, I have been cooped up here too long, so I am leaving in a couple of days, going to visit some of my former colleagues all around in Prussia. I'll be gone a month or so. Is that all right with you? Tashinori asked carefully. Izuku managed to smile. That sounds wonderful, father. You'll make it back just in time for the ball Katsuki is throwing in Blackheart Manor. Oh well, all right then. He chuckled. I must admit I am a bit nervous. It has been a while since I was properly a part of society. Tashinori admitted. I'm sure you'll do great, and while you're there you can boast all you want about your awesome son. Izuku teased lightheartedly. I would like it if you would regularly update Mr. Aizawa if you plan to go out or such, just so neither of us will worry. I've also informed him if you'd prefer to just eat dinner alone with your friends or such, that those wishes be granted. Izuku smiled warmly at his father, grateful for the way he had evolved and loosened his hold onto his son. Thank you, he said, hugging his father tightly. While I am away, I suggest you iron out this wrinkle in your relationship with young Mr. Bakugo. I can see it has taken its toll on both of you recently. Toshinori said with a knowing glint in his eyes that made Izuku squirm. Yeah, all right. He finally concluded with a surrendering chuckle. So, Izuku decided he would try and stop this awkwardness between him and his not friend, while his father was away. He did not know exactly what he would do, he just knew he missed Katsuki, and he wanted to fix that as quickly as possible. How lively the town seems, Mina said with a wide grin. Her arm was wrapped around Izuku's as they'd gone to explore the town. The rest of the group walked right behind them, Katsuki being the last. It was a cloudy day, but they all still carried their parasols around. Izuku had thought it might be a good idea to bond if they went on a small excursion, and he had wanted to buy some more arrows anyway. They went around to the small tents and booths set up along the main road. Mina was eyeing out some beautiful jewelry and Denki was enraptured by a traveler who'd brought fireworks. Izuku giggled fondly at their excitement, yet he couldn't ignore Katsuki's lingering gaze. It was obvious that the blonde had over the last few days become irritable and annoyed with just about everything. Izuku sent him a shy smile, making it obvious he was aware that he was being watched. The incident caused Katsuki to look away with flushed cheeks. Izuku had been pondering ever since Toshinori had encouraged him to fix their relationship. He did not know exactly what he should do, but he knew that he wanted Katsuki back as he was before, perhaps even more. He knew friends didn't pleasure themselves while thinking of each other, yet he'd done it on several accounts now. He knew friends didn't share the intimacy they did, and most importantly, he knew he wanted Katsuki in every sense of the word. He did not like the way the villagers eyed the tall blonde, nor how a couple of young girls giggled excitedly as they passed him. He wanted Katsuki to himself, and for once he did not want to share. What do you think, Izuku? These are nice, right? Mina exclaimed as she held up a beautiful pair of earrings. They're gorgeous, Izuku said warmly. Are you thinking of getting them? Maybe. We do share an affinity for beautiful things in our group. Mina chuckled. I have noticed that you always look so put together, all of you, Izuku remarked. It was true. The group were always stunning to behold, each in their own way. He had noticed it in Blackheart Manor too, the way they collected pretty things. It did not seem unusual since the group seemed rather wealthy, though Izuku wasn't really sure how they came into their money. Katsuki and Denki were nobles, or at the very least of higher birth, but both Mina and Kirishima came from lesser parts, and he was unsure of how they could afford such an extravagant lifestyle. It's why you fit right in with us. You're so pretty, Izuku, your eyes look like emeralds, Mina exclaimed happily. Izuku blushed at the compliment. He did notice how Katsuki huffed angrily as Mina complimented him, and he smirked knowingly. It seemed like Izuku was not the only one who wanted to have a possessive claim to the other. The information warmed his heart, and his body got all tingly. Suddenly the church bells rang and the conversations on the street halted as they all parted, leaving the main road open. A group of singing mourners entered, carrying a coffin. Izuku instantly bowed to pay his respect as he joined in on the song to honor the dead. He had heard it was a young traveler, passing through these parts. The town was not big, so if someone passed, the news spread fast. As far as he could tell, the traveler had suddenly fallen gravely ill and died within a week. Izuku had not noticed how his friends had scurried further away, clutching their hands desperately over their ears, until he heard Katsuki let out a painful groan. The sound caught his attention, and he darted to his friends in confusion. They all looked to be in severe pain. Make it stop, Mina insisted. What's going on? Izuku insisted as he started guiding the group further away from the ceremony. I hate religious people, Denki spat. Why did you sing with them? Shiro hissed like he was hurt. What do you mean? I was simply paying my respects, Izuku argued, confused. This whole ordeal is sacrilegious, Why must everyone stop and pay respect to the deceased? Everyone must die at some point. Katsuki pointed out, finally regaining his proper posture. However, he still looked bewildered. It is a funeral. There is nothing wrong with offering one's respect, Izuku said firmly. On the contrary, it is quite disturbing. They're pushing the religion onto us, like we are wrong for not being enslaved to the same concept as them. What are you on about? If you do not share the same belief, just disregard it. How can we ignore such an inconvenience when it spreads faster than cholera? And the whole Dmed town joining in, what an awful institution. Katsuki burst out offended. Izuku winced surprised as he realized just how much the passing funeral seemed to have affected the whole group. They were all glaring at him like he'd done something wrong for joining in and offering his respect. I thought you cared for us. Why would you hurt us like this? Mina asked confused. What do you mean? I am not hurting you. Please don't do that again. Shiro pleaded. What? Izuku gaped. Don't sing along or follow their disturbed rituals if you are not one of them. Kirishima explained with a sigh. I apologize, we seem to be coming on a bit harshly. It is not our intention. We were simply surprised as you have not before shown signs of being any sort of religious. I am not, but I was simply being courteous. How about being courteous towards us next time? Katsuki huffed. If you knew what that beast was capable of, you would not feel so sorry for him. He insisted. And you do. Izuku retorted back. Katsuki looked like he wanted to argue further, but Kirishima clasped his hand around his mouth and sent him a warning glare that eventually made the other back off. Listen, I am sorry if I made you uncomfortable. That was not my intention. Izuku sighed, giving up the discussion in favor of comforting his friends, who above all else looked hurt. Please don't do that again, we like you too much. Mina sobbed as she attacked Izuku in a hug. Soon the rest followed, excluding Katsuki who was standing awkwardly to the side. He looked like he wanted to join in but also seemed hesitant. Izuku freed his left arm and held out an inviting hand towards him, accompanied by a soft smile. The blonde tried to hide his smile as he jumped in and buried his face inside the crook of Izuku's neck like he used to do. He almost tilted the whole group in his effort to become the one closest to Izuku, which caused affectionate laughter to spread through the group until the uncertain feelings lingering had been washed away. Let's go home, Izuku stated, and the others eagerly agreed. The rest of the afternoon passed by swiftly, and at dinner time they ate together without Mr. Aizawa present, which caused a livelier conversation to flow. Izuku liked the feeling of freedom he experienced with the friend group, especially when away from prying eyes or supervision of any kind. He had noticed how Katsuki's gaze had become warmer since they'd all hugged, and Izuku relished in the feeling. When the others went to the red parlor to relax and pass time, Izuku tugged gently at Katsuki's sleeve. Shall we go on an evening stroll? He suggested innocently. Katsuki's almost evil smile re-emerged. It had recently been tucked away under one of politeness for a while now, and Izuku missed the intensity that followed the predatory look. His body responded to it as well, his fingertips already tingling with excitement. You want me alone? Katsuki asked suggestively, raising his brow. Izuku's face ran red, and his smile dropped instantaneously. He could not deny that had been his intention as well as the hidden intention Katsuki suggested. The blonde burst into that rough laughter that sent shivers down his spine. So, what do you want now that you have me all to yourself? Katsuki teased as they'd begun strolling in the gardens with the sun nearly gone. Izuku bit into his lip nervously. What did he want to say? Now he wasn't even sure. There was only one thing he was certain of. He gently wrapped his hand around Katsuki's wrist, making them halt among the butterfly bushes. I miss you, Izuku said quietly, scared the other would make fun of him. Katsuki looked surprised as he took in the sight of the anxious freckled boy who was refusing to look directly into his eyes. Miss me like a friend, or miss me as something else entirely? Katsuki asked quietly. I miss you, but not as a friend. Izuku squeaked embarrassed, before hiding his face in his palms, thinking he might pass away from mortification. Just so we're clear, no more talk of friends when it comes to the two of us? Katsuki asked, a smirk trailing along his lips. Izuku angrily threw his hands around in a dramatic tantrum. How many times do you want me to say it? I like you, damn it. Stop being an idiot about it. He yelled, frustrated. A silence settled between the two of them, and Izuku clasped his hands over his mouth in shock, not having had any intention of admitting that openly just yet. Katsuki's beautiful fingers pried away his hands as he stepped closer, looking aggressively at Izuku. He was pleased, well beyond pleased actually. Even Izuku could tell that amidst his frustration. He melted away under that dangerously possessive glare that Katsuki had managed to perfect. He was so turned on from being looked at like that, he felt like he was going insane. Anyone else would have run away in fear at seeing that expression, but Izuku loved it. He had longed for it. You're so perfect. Katsuki stated, satisfied. Izuku disagreed with that, and most people probably would, but he was swimming in the feeling that the compliment evoked inside of him. Katsuki's hand reached up and cradled his cheek affectionately, the other curled around his back, tugging him harshly closer until there was barely an inch between their faces. Do you still want my love if I am not what you think I am? Katsuki asked, removing a stray piece of hair on his forehead, his lips stopping just before Izuku's lips. Izuku let out a gasp of excitement. I want all of you. He whispered, earning a yearning growl from Katsuki that made him sound more animal than human. Suddenly Katsuki hastily set off, dragging the confused Izuku by the arm as he ran, very fast back towards the manor. Izuku was a bit thrown off since he'd expected a kiss, not to be dragged off to God knows where like his life depended on it. Where are we going? Izuku yelped as he nearly fell to his, but if it hadn't been for Katsuki holding him up and not slowing down in the process. He recognized Katsuki was taking him in the direction of Izuku's room, and he felt extremely confused and oddly self-aware. Katsuki pushed him into the room, smacking it closed after him, before towering over Izuku that was now pressed between Katsuki's body and the door. Izuku stared speechlessly at him. What are you doing? Izuku exclaimed as he felt one beautiful hand sliding down his back towards his butt. He was glowing red as he looked into those wild eyes. Then Katsuki's lips crashed onto his, and Izuku lost all will to protest. He curled his arms around that pale neck and kissed him back eagerly. He heard the click of the lock on his door and glanced at Katsuki's hand on the key, before looking back at those mesmerizing eyes. Katsuki was smirking wildly at him, and Izuku felt himself lose what was left of his sanity and tighten the grip around the blonde, forcing them closer together. Katsuki responded by planting both his hands on Izuku's firm behind before he effortlessly lifted him off the ground. Izuku gasped in surprise and in retaliation locked his legs tightly around his torso. My perfect darling. Katsuki breathed between kisses. Izuku felt himself purr like a kitten under the endearing nickname. He loved the praise. He loved the feeling of being the center of the Katsuki's attention. Suddenly he was thrown across the room and shrieked in surprise as he landed on the big bed, spread out while the blonde towered over him, licking his lips like he was digging into a feast. Izuku was horrified, intrigued and excited all at the same time. He watched him as he discarded boots and tailcoat, slowly peeling off the layers while never breaking eye contact. Almost like he was putting on a show. Izuku's mouth watered as he saw the marble-white skin he had been dreaming of. He watched the muscles tense as Katsuki moved. He had a deep urge to mark the pale skin, to cover it in love marks and bites, tearing apart the perfect skin. Izuku's eyes stalked down his body and halted at his pee-pee. See something you like, pretty boy? Katsuki asked, snaking over him as he started loosening the buttons on Izuku's clothing, undressing him right there on the bed. He was frozen from shock as Katsuki's hand dragged off his clothes while his mouth left kisses on every piece of newly exposed skin until Izuku too found himself as naked as the day he'd been born. Katsuki took a step back, eyeing him intensely. Izuku felt exposed and uncertain. He was blushing wildly, trying to cover himself up. No need to be shy, darling. Katsuki whispered as he lowered himself to the floor, dragging Izuku's legs closer until Katsuki was hovering right over his pee-pee, fingers digging into his hips. Please. I am not experienced with this. Izuku admitted embarrassed. Oh no, what a lie. Katsuki smirked knowingly, grazing a hand against his length so it twitched in response. What? Izuku yelped. I know how you my name when you pleasure yourself. Katsuki's red eyes pierced through the darkness and captured Izuku's green ones. He gaped surprised and forgot all about composing himself or trying to cover it up. Why you were watching me? Izuku asked, partly horrified, partly turned on. I am always watching you, Izuku. Katsuki said and kept eye contact as his tongue licked all the way from his ball to the tip, making Izuku squirm. He felt hot and weird all over. He knew he should be scared out of his mind to find out Katsuki had been watching him at night, but some sick and twisted and rapidly growing part of him was happy. He liked that Katsuki kept his undivided focus on. Rationality had long since flown out the window when it came to Katsuki anyway, and truthfully, he was no better. He let out a loud as Katsuki closed his mouth over Izuku's pee-pee, digging his fingers into his thighs. Izuku felt himself nearly go blind from the sensation of the tongue swirling around and caressing his hard length. His own hands were buried in the sheets to stop himself from forcing Katsuki's face down. Just as he was gasping for air, close to release, Katsuki let go of him. Izuku rolled his face around to stare angrily at him. Not fair if you're the only one. Katsuki teased before getting on his feet and suddenly guided Izuku's thighs together and held them closely against his body. What or why? Izuku's voice trailed off into a as he felt Katsuki's slick pre-cum against his tightly pressed thighs. Soon the large length followed, rubbing against Izuku's own. Katsuki started moving his thighs first slowly, making sure to press onto Izuku's own pee-pee, before picking up the speed. Sweat and pre-cum slicked up his thighs, and he felt the constant smacking against his butt, the pressing onto his own arsehole. It was too much. Katsuki tightened his hold, nearly lifting Izuku off the bed, to get deeper between his thighs. You have no idea how long I've wanted this. Katsuki panted, pouncing harder, making everything bounce. Izuku was tingling all over as the release built up. His whole body was going livid. He had no idea he could even feel all of this. Izuku was heaving for air as he felt the final push over the edge and exploded over his stomach in a loud that seemed to push the love-struck blonde over the edge as well. Katsuki opened his eyes and took in the ruined sight of Izuku. His thighs were red, stomach covered in cum, flushed face and teary eyes. So beautiful. He mumbled to himself as he released the thighs he had taken hostage. Izuku was still coming down from the orgasm when he felt Katsuki's kisses against his collarbones. He guided the face up to meet his own and smiled into the kiss. That was amazing. Izuku whispered, kissing him softly. Want to try it for real this time? Katsuki smirked. Katsuki, you can't possibly be. Izuku's gaze lowered to Katsuki's pee-pee, which was in fact very much ready to go again. But I haven't. I don't know how. Izuku admitted embarrassed and looked away. Let me teach you and you can tell me if it is too much, he said, kissing him again. All right. Izuku agreed. He was both curious and nervous. He knew technically how it worked, but he had never tried anything like that, and he didn't understand how it could even be pleasurable for anyone, but he would try. Katsuki's slender fingers ran further down his body, collecting their cum on his fingertips before they teasingly halted at his entrance. The blonde planted a heated kiss on his lips as a finger gently massaged his hole. Izuku gasped into the kiss, unsure of what to do or how to feel. Then the finger trailed along the tight rim before breaking inside. Izuku winced in surprise. He didn't hate it but wasn't sure he liked it either. It felt tight and weird. Trying to cut off my finger? Katsuki whispered and nipped into his ear. Sorry. Izuku mumbled. Don't apologize, darling. He smirked as his other hand caressed his chest. While one hand pleasured his chest, the other loosened his hole, massaging it. Gradually Izuku started to relax under the comforting touch. Then the finger ventured deeper and Izuku shrieked at the sensation. Then all of a sudden, he felt a pressure on some unknown part of him that made him involuntarily arch his back and in pleasure. Both of them were surprised by his reaction. What was that? Izuku asked. The finger pressed against it again, making him squirm. Seems I found your sweet spot. Katsuki groaned satisfied, like it was turning him on just to see Izuku caught at his mercy, wincing under every touch. You like that? He asked, kissing his chest, letting his tongue curl around Izuku's stiffening nipples. He had no idea so many parts of his body could be sensitive, and he was exploding internally at the discovery of the many unforeseen pleasuring points he had never thought of. Then another finger pressed inside of him, widening his pulsating insides, pushing against the walls. Izuku ummed again, leaning into the new feeling. At first, he'd been hesitant and unsure, but Katsuki was so achingly slow and generous with exploring his insides he couldn't help but love every part of it. The two fingers rubbed against his delicate flesh, opening it wider. Izuku yanked Katsuki by the neck, kissing him wildly to express his own pleasure, and he finally found use for his hands that both kept Katsuki in place and trailed down his torso until it gripped his PP, making the other gasp in surprise as the fingers clenched inside of him. Bunny, don't tempt me too much or I'll end up hurting you. Katsuki breathed heavily, clearly trying to hold back as his fingers fed his hole in a more desperate pace. Izuku grinned wickedly, tightening his hold on Katsuki's leaking PP, leaving him shivering from excitement. I thought you were going to do it properly? Izuku teased. The blonde cursed wildly before drawing back his fingers and leaning back, just outside of Izuku's hold, while positioning himself. Tell me if it hurts, was all he said as the leaking tip pressed against his hole. Izuku gasped excitedly, and then he felt the length enter him. He was stiff, suddenly aware he'd teased the blonde too much as the PP was a lot girthier than the fingers. Relax, darling, or you'll snap it off. Katsuki chuckled warmly, letting his fingers run down Izuku's pages. The other hand pressed firmly down on his thigh, spreading the legs further apart. Gradually, Izuku felt himself become filled up with Katsuki's length. It pressed against every wall on his insides the further it got, and when it hit the spot and Izuku let out a short scream of surprise, he halted, giving Izuku time to become familiar with the sensation. The pale hands traveled up, one curling into Izuku's wild and curly hair, the other locking onto his wrist, before he leaned down, his PP following him as he kissed Izuku. As their kisses grew, Katsuki started slowly rocking against him, as if trying out the waters. Izuku's legs wrapped around the torso once again, making it easier for Katsuki to enter him fully, and he did. Izuku could have sworn he saw stars as he felt the first real move inside of him, rubbing against that delicate sweet spot. He released all kinds of sounds he thought himself incapable of as Katsuki moved deep and hard into him. His emness grew louder and more unfiltered as Katsuki pounced into his butt. The smacking sound of flesh and panting breaths filled the room. Izuku started biting into the pale shoulder, harder with every hit, eventually drawing blood as the pace quickened and his body heated up relentlessly. The poking inside of his stomach alongside the swirling pleasure drove him to lean further into the touch. Katsuki's hands spread open his cheeks as Izuku clung onto his shoulders, lifting themselves up until they were almost sitting on the bed, one moving up, the other bouncing down as their pace and breaths mingled with eagerness for release. Katsuki started a chant of cursing along with words of affirmation and affection mingled together. Every word felt like scalding water being doused over Izuku's already pent-up body until he reached his climax, and ummed loudly, arching his back, throwing back his head in bliss. Katsuki released inside of him at the sight of the love-crazed maniac miming like a goddess and clenching his insides so tightly, as if begging him to follow. They stayed in that position for a while, coming down from the shared high of their orgasms. Izuku's expression was dazed and happy as he pulled his head back up. Katsuki's PP twitched inside of him at the sight. You're so goddamn magnificent. Katsuki ummed before burying his face in the crook of Izuku's neck. Izuku hugged him tightly, hiding his face as he felt the leakage slowly leaving his aching hole. His whole body was exhausted and spent from the event, yet he had never felt more content, and he wished he could stay in that moment forever. When Izuku's legs finally started to catch up with their activities, he felt them beginning to cramp up, and slowly unfolded his tight hold on Katsuki. "How is it, are you okay?" Katsuki asked as he released him, pulling out his pee-pee with a loud squelching sound erupting into the room, making them both flushed. "That was fantastic," Izuku said with a smile. "I had no idea it could be so pleasurable for both of us." Katsuki grinned wildly. "Come on, nerd, you need to get washed up before going to bed," he said, dragging Izuku into his arms and carrying him across the room towards the bathroom. "Katsuki, I can do this myself," Izuku insisted, embarrassed. "Nonsense, I take good care of what's mine." Katsuki winked before finally putting him down on the ground inside the smaller room. Izuku was shocked to find his legs nearly giving out under him, and he grabbed helplessly onto Katsuki, who was only grinning satisfied. "This is so humiliating," Izuku stated as he rubbed some feeling into his sore legs. "Don't touch yourself like that or you'll get me riled up for round 3, Katsuki said with a suggestively raised brow. Izuku's face fell instantly, and he hid his hands behind his back, which only made the other bark into loud laughter. While Izuku sat down on a wooden bench, Katsuki dug into the nearby basin of water and started soaking a sponge before delicately scrubbing every inch of Izuku's body and drying him off. He used the time to study the blonde's calm face with his lips turning into a small smile. Izuku loved the feeling of knowing he was the cause of that pleasant and relaxed smile. The way Katsuki carefully inspected and cleaned every part of him with such care made him weaker in the knees than he already was. "You're so nice, Katsuki," Izuku sighed happily. The blonde flinched and looked surprised at him. "Nice?" he asked, shocked, like no one had ever described him as such before. "Yeah, you're so good to me, kind and affectionate, and you're so attentive to my needs. I have never met anybody half as good as you are before." Katsuki simply stared in shock before a crimson blush spread across his cheeks, betraying his face that turned into a scowl before retorting, "I am not nice." "You take that back." Izuku giggled at his outburst, and the blonde's face relaxed again upon seeing it, at least until he caught himself doing it and forced himself to look away. "Don't be so defensive about it, I like it," Izuku said, turning his face with a soft caress of his hand, forcing the two to lock eyes. "I like that you only show it to me," he said, his voice deepening into something more dominating. Katsuki leaned into the touch and darkness that escaped Izuku's mouth. The two sat like that for a short while, Katsuki kneeling in front of Izuku, leaning into his twisted affections with eagerness. Finally, he tore himself loose, hastily cleaned off himself before scooping Izuku up yet again and carrying him back towards the messy bed. Both of them huddled together in a hug under the covers. Izuku was wrapped securely in strong arms, leaning into that perfect chest while inhaling the intoxicating scent that Katsuki carried with him. His aching body and sore behind was lovingly caressed, and for the first time in a long time, he fell into a deep sleep, one not disturbed by his daily nightmares. A simple, nice and warm dream.